The champagne toast became a war before anyone at the reception noticed. I remember my sister's voice cutting through the crowd first. It was sharp and sweet at the same time, a sweetness that hit a blade. I remember the string quartet stopping mid-note. Then I remember her hand. Then the sound of it landing across my face, in front of 600 people who had traveled from every corner of the state. They had come to watch me get married, not to watch me get humiliated in a white dress in front of everyone I had ever known. Nobody moved for a second. Nobody breathed. 600 faces watched me in silence, waiting to see what I would do next. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand. That was the exact moment the side door opened. My fiancé walked in. I did not know. Standing there with my cheek still burning and my ears still ringing, I did not know the man stepping through that doorway would make the entire room go silent just by walking in. I did not know that some of the people sitting at those tables had done business with him for years without ever once putting a face to the name. I did not know that the very family sitting closest to the altar had been smiling for the cameras an hour earlier. They already knew more about him than I did. And I did not know that the worst betrayal of that night would not even be the one that left a mark on my skin. That slap was only the beginning. It was not even close to the worst thing my own family would do to me before this was over. It would not be my sister who did the most damage. Before I go on, tell me where you're watching this from tonight. I want to know how far this story is traveling. If you have ever been the one your own family overlooked, the one nobody expected anything from until you finally stopped shrinking yourself to fit their idea of you, hit like and subscribe right now. This story is for you, and for anyone who has ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know them best. My name is Eleanor, and I was 29 years old on the day my own sister slapped me in front of everyone I loved. At my own wedding. The morning of my wedding started the way most mornings of my life had started, quietly, and mostly unnoticed. I spent it at Ashworth University's Rare Book Conservation Lab, which was not where a bride was supposed to be 6 hours before her own ceremony. I had one last item to finish before my 2-week leave began. A water-damaged household ledger from 1861 that a donor family had kept folded in an attic trunk for over a century. My supervisor told me twice to go home. I told her twice that a book does not care whether I am getting married. Paper fibers only forgive you if you treat them the same way on any given day. That was the truth about me that most people never bothered to learn. I liked things that required patience. I liked work that nobody applauded. Work you did with cotton gloves and a magnifying lamp and absolute silence. Because the reward was not attention. The reward was that something fragile survived one more generation because you had been careful with it. I had been the careful one in my family for as long as I could remember. My sister Portia was the one people noticed the moment she walked into a room. I was the one people noticed had left it. Growing up, our parents kept a corkboard in the kitchen for report cards and school photos, later replaced by magazine clippings whenever Portia's boutique got mentioned in a local lifestyle blog. My university acceptance letter had gone up there once, briefly, before it was quietly swapped for a photo of Portia at a launch party. Nobody ever said the words out loud. Nobody had to. I understood my role in that house by the age of 11, and I built an entire adult life around never needing anyone to notice me at all. Conservation work suited that wound better than any therapist ever had. A torn page does not care that you were the forgotten daughter. It only cares whether your hands are steady. By noon, I was standing in a dressing suite at Ravenswood Manor, a restored 19th century estate 2 hours outside the city. watching a seamstress make final adjustments to a dress I had chosen because it did not look like it was trying to prove anything. 600 guests were expected by early evening. My mother had wanted 800. My father had wanted a tent large enough for a small stadium. I had wanted something that felt like mine. And Ravenswood, with its restored library wing and overgrown rose garden, was the closest thing to that I could find. Julian and I had chosen it together on our third date, before either of us admitted we were falling in love. We wandered into the estate's small archive room by accident, looking for a bathroom, and found ourselves in front of a locked glass case of 18th century correspondence instead. He asked me what the letters said. Most men on a third date ask what you want to order. Julian asked me to read 240-year-old handwriting out loud in a room that smelled like dust and cedar. And I knew, somewhere in that moment, that I would marry him. He worked in supply chain consulting, or that was what he told people, and what he told me for the first several months we dated. He was not secretive in a way that felt like a warning. He was simply quiet about himself in a way that felt like relief. I had grown up in a family where every accomplishment was announced at dinner like a press release. Julian never once mentioned money unless I asked him directly. And even then, he answered like someone changing the subject as politely as possible. I did not marry him because I knew what he was worth. I married him because he never once asked me to be smaller, so someone else in the room could look bigger. Somewhere on the other side of the manor, in a guest cottage reserved for the groom's party, Julian was getting dressed with his best man, refusing on principle to see me before the ceremony. It was an old superstition, the kind neither of us truly believed in, but we kept it anyway, mostly because his grandmother had asked us to, and because there was something steadying about one tradition holding its shape on a day when everything else felt like it was moving too fast. My mother, Diane, arrived in my dressing suite a little after 1 o'clock, already dressed, already emotional in the way she got emotional at events with witnesses. She fussed with a loose curl near my ear and told me I looked beautiful. Then, almost in the same breath, mentioned that Portia's flight had been delayed and she hoped her sister would make it in time to help with my hair. I told her it was fine. It was always fine. I had spent 29 years making things fine, so that the day would not have to bend around anyone's disappointment in me. Before my mother arrived, I walked the long way through the manor's library wing, still in my robe, to see the room once more before it filled with strangers. The staff had spent the morning turning the great hall into a reception space, laying 600 place settings across round tables draped in ivory linen, building a small stage near the string quartet for the toasts. A 10-tier arrangement of white peonies stood where the head table would be. I remember thinking the flowers looked like something that could be knocked over easily, and thinking it was strange that the thought had crossed my mind at all on a day meant to be nothing but joy. My father, Walter, passed me in the corridor, checking the seating chart for what he called the important tables, the ones closest to the front. He kissed my forehead and told me I looked like my grandmother. Then he checked his watch twice in 10 seconds, distracted by something he would not explain. I noticed it. I filed it away the way I filed every small inconsistency in my family, quietly, without comment. I did not know yet how much that particular habit of quiet filing, of noticing and saying nothing, was about to cost me. Portia arrived at 2:30, 40 minutes later than planned. She trailed a garment bag and a kind of energy that filled the dressing suite before she even opened the door. "You would not believe the flight," she said, already reaching for a mimosa from the tray the venue had left for the bridal party. She was wearing a deep emerald dress. The color was so saturated it pulled every eye in the room away from the pale ivory gown on the rack behind me. I noticed it. I said nothing. I had stopped commenting on Portia's wardrobe choices around the same year I stopped expecting her to ask about mine. She kissed the air near my cheek, careful not to smudge her lipstick, and made one full circle around the room, taking in the flowers, the mirror lights, the garment bags lined up along the wall, before she finally looked at me directly. "You look sweet," she said. Sweet was not a word Portia used for things she admired. It was the word she used for things she had already decided were smaller than her. My mother swept in behind her, relieved in the particular way she was always relieved when Portia showed up at all, regardless of how late. Diane fixed a curl near my temple that did not need fixing and told me, again, that I looked beautiful, and then, in the same breath she used to compliment me, she pivoted toward my sister. "Portia, sweetheart, did you get everything sorted with the vendor? The one from last month." Portia waved a hand, dismissive. She glanced at her reflection instead of answering. "It's handled. Mostly handled. I'll pay them back once things pick up again." "Of course you will," my mother said, her reply automatic and practiced, more like a reflex than anything she had really thought through. She turned back to me and added, almost as an afterthought, "We'll sort it out after the wedding. No need to think about that today." I did not know what vendor she meant, and I did not ask. It was such a familiar rhythm in our family. The sound of money moving quietly around Portia's ventures had taught me not to hear it as information. It was just weather. It happened, and then it passed, and nobody expected me to have an opinion about it. My father knocked once and stepped halfway into the room. He was still adjusting his cufflinks and checking his phone before he even looked up at me. "Eleanor, you look lovely," he said, and he meant it. I could tell he meant it. But his eyes kept drifting to the screen in his hand. "Everything all right?" "Dad? Fine, fine." He slid the phone into his jacket pocket too quickly. "Just the plant. A supplier issue, nothing that concerns today." The plant was what he called Voss Meridian fabrication, when he did not want to actually talk about it. A habit I had noticed without naming for years. Whenever someone at a family dinner asked how the business was doing, his answers got shorter and vaguer, and he changed the subject faster than a man who had good news to share ever would. I had asked him directly, once over Christmas, how the company was holding up against the larger manufacturers moving into the region. He had laughed it off and asked me instead how my little book projects were going, and I had let him redirect me, the way I let most things in my family get redirected. "You should call Grandma Margaret's old trust and see if there's anything left over there for your honeymoon," Portia said suddenly, apropos of nothing, still studying her reflection. "Didn't she leave you something when we were kids? Mom manages that," I said. "I haven't thought about it in years." "Right," Diane said quickly, a beat too quickly, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my sleeve. "It's all very boring, sweetheart. Nothing worth interrupting your wedding day over. Let's focus on you." I let it go. The way I let everything go. That day I was supposed to be thinking about flowers and vows and the man waiting for me at the other end of the aisle. Not about a decade-old trust fund, a supplier issue at my father's plant, or a vendor Portia owed money to. I had built a lifetime of letting small, strange comments pass through me without catching on anything. And on my wedding day, of all days. I had no interest in becoming suspicious of my own family. Through the tall window of the dressing suite, I could see the courtyard filling below. Valets in matching vests waved cars toward the gravel lot. Caterers wheeled silver trays past the rose garden, and the string quartet tuned near the great hall entrance. Somewhere in that crowd, 600 people were arriving to watch two families become one. I remember thinking, absurdly, that most of them probably could not have named a single thing I did for a living, and that I did not mind. Because today was not about being known. It was about being chosen, finally, by someone who already knew exactly who I was. The photographer knocked at 3 o'clock, and the room shifted into motion, my mother reaching for her clutch, Portia downing the last of her mimosa in one motion, my father excusing himself to check on the guests already arriving in the courtyard below. I stood in front of the mirror one last time, alone for exactly 4 seconds, and looked at a woman I barely recognized. Not because of the dress, because for the first time in a long time, I looked like someone people were about to pay attention to. I did not know it would only last a few hours before that attention turned into something else entirely. The great hall at Ravenswood Manor held 600 people, the way a held breath holds air, tight and gleaming and waiting for something to happen. Round tables draped in ivory linen stretched out beneath restored oak beams, original to the estate's 1880 construction. Crystal glassware caught the last gold light slanting through the tall windows. Somewhere near the back, the string quartet had shifted into something slower, a signal that the meal was ending and the toasts were about to begin. I sat at the head table beside an empty chair reserved for Julian, who was still finishing photographs with his groomsmen in the rose garden. I watched the room settle the way a held breath finally exhales. American wedding tradition, at least in the version my mother had insisted on for months, put the father of the bride first. Walter stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the small stage the venue had built beside the string quartet. Someone handed him a microphone. He tapped it once, cleared his throat, and looked out over 600 faces that had traveled from 3 states to be here. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate my daughter," he began, and for a moment his voice carried the warmth I remembered from childhood, before dinner table silences and distracted phone checks had become the more familiar version of him. Eleanor has always been the quiet one in our family, the one who noticed things the rest of us missed. It should have felt like a compliment. Something in his tone made it land differently, like an apology hiding inside praise. The Voss name has meant something in this state for 3 generations. He continued, and here his voice shifted, gaining a formality that did not belong at a wedding toast. My grandfather built Voss Meridian Fabrication with his own 2 hands after the war. My father turned it into a company that supplied steel and precision parts to half the machinery in this region. I have spent my whole life trying to be worthy of what they built. That is not a small thing to carry. A few guests exchanged the sort of looks people give when a speech drifts off script. I glanced at my mother. She was smiling too hard, her knuckles pale against the stem of her wine glass. Beside her, Portia had gone very still. She watched our father with an expression I couldn't name, something between embarrassment and recognition, as if she'd caught a reference the rest of the room missed entirely. I had spent my whole life reading rooms for a living, in a way. Not that kind of room. Not a ballroom full of taffeta and cologne. These were rooms made of paper and ink, where the smallest inconsistency in a signature or a watermark told you everything about who had really written a document and why. I had that same instinct now. I watched my father's hands tighten slightly around the microphone stand and saw the muscle in his jaw work before each sentence. Every part of that instinct told me something didn't add up, Legacy is not something you're given, Walter said. And now he was looking somewhere past the crowd, past me, at nothing in particular. It's something you protect, sometimes at cost, sometimes when nobody else understands why you're protecting it. He paused until the silence grew awkward. Then, as if catching himself, he softened and steered his words back to the occasion at hand. But today isn't about the plant, or the family name, or any of that. Today is about my daughter, who found someone who sees her the way she deserves to be seen. To Eleanor and Julian, 600 glasses rose. I raised mine too, smiling for the cameras stationed at 3 points around the hall. Underneath the smile, I turned his words over the way I turn a fragile page before deciding whether it could bear a repair. Protect at cost. Nobody else understands why. It was not language that belonged in a father of the bride toast. It was language that belonged to a man rehearsing an excuse he had not yet needed to use. I looked toward the side entrance near the garden, hoping to see Julian slip in before the next toast started. But the doorway stayed empty. Somewhere in that crowd, I would learn later, sat 2 men who ran regional supply firms that did business with Kane Meridian Capital and a woman on the city planning board. She had once sat across a negotiating table from Julian himself, without either of my parents ever thinking to ask his last name twice. None of them said anything yet. They simply watched, the way people watch a stage before the curtain rises on the part of the play they actually came for. My mother squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that Walter always got sentimental after a second scotch, and I let myself believe her, because believing her was easier than sitting with the alternative, which was that my father had just stood in front of 600 people and said something true by accident. The waitstaff moved between tables, refilling glasses, and for a moment the hall filled with the low hum of 600 private conversations resuming, guests turning back to each other, forks resting against dessert plates, the tension of the toast dissolving into the ordinary noise of a party. I let my shoulders drop for the first time in an hour. I told myself the hardest part of the day was already behind me, that whatever strange undercurrent had passed through my father's words was simply nerves. A man unused to public speaking reaching for grander language than the moment required. The quartet shifted again, cueing the next speaker. Portia stood, smoothing the front of her emerald dress, and made her way toward the microphone with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been waiting all day for her turn to hold the room. I did not know yet that her turn would end with my face against the marble floor. Portia took the microphone the way she took every room she had ever walked into, like it already belonged to her, and she was simply reminding everyone of that fact. "Some of you know me as the fun sister," she started, and the crowd laughed, warm and easy, the kind of laugh that comes before anyone has reason to be careful. Eleanor and I are pretty different. She's the quiet one. I'm the one who actually likes attention. Another laugh. She was good at this, better than Walter had been, and for a few sentences I let myself believe the toast would stay exactly where toasts like this were supposed to stay, affectionate and a little teasing and over within 2 minutes. Growing up, Eleanor always had her nose in some old book nobody else wanted to touch, she continued, turning slightly toward our table, toward me. While I was out building things, meeting people, starting a brand, my sister was in a basement somewhere gluing pages back together. I used to tell my friends, my sister repairs things nobody else cares about anymore. I meant it as a compliment. Mostly. She paused for effect, letting the microphone pick up the small laugh she gave herself. The kind of laugh performers use to signal the audience that more was coming. The laugh that followed was thinner this time, a few guests glancing at each other, unsure whether the joke had landed where it was supposed to land. I had heard some version of this speech before, at other people's dinner tables, at holidays, at the launch party for Portia's first boutique 3 years earlier, where she had introduced me to a room of strangers as her sister who worked with old paper. It had never bothered me enough to say anything, because saying something had always felt like more trouble than it was worth. Like correcting a child mid-tantrum in front of company. I had built an entire personality around not being the kind of person who caused a scene, and Portia had built an entire personality around knowing exactly how far she could push that particular habit of mine before I would fold. And now she's marrying a man who works in, what is it again? Supply chain logistics. Portia squinted playfully toward the empty chair beside me, still waiting on Julian. I have to say, when Eleanor told us about him, I pictured someone a little more, I don't know, memorable. But I guess that tracks. My sister has always had a talent for finding things other people overlooked and deciding they were special anyway. I felt the shift in the room before I understood it. A stiffening at the nearby tables, forks pausing halfway to mouths. My mother's smile had gone rigid. I kept my own face still, the way I had trained myself to keep it still through a childhood of smaller versions of exactly this moment. But something in my chest had started to burn in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne. "I'm not trying to be harsh," Portia said, though nothing in her tone suggested she believed that sentence even as she said it. "I just think it's funny, is all. My whole life. Everyone told me to be more like Eleanor, be quieter, be more careful, take fewer risks. And here I am, building something real, something with my name on it, while she spent a decade in a basement making sure nobody notices her at all. I guess tonight she finally got her moment in the spotlight. Better late than never." Right. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the tables closest to the stage. I saw my father's jaw tighten. I saw my mother lift her wine glass and not take a sip. Just hold it, like the glass alone was keeping her hands from shaking. Portia was not finished. She rarely stopped at the first uncomfortable laugh. She treated silence like an audience waiting for a better line, and she reached for one. "Honestly, I give her credit," she said, raising her own glass toward me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "It takes a certain kind of confidence to marry the first man who doesn't ask too many questions about what you do for a living. Not everyone gets that lucky. Some of us actually have to be interesting to keep someone's attention." The comment landed harder than the ones before it. It was sharp enough that even the polite laughter died out completely. I heard my own pulse in my ears. Beside me, the empty chair where Julian should have been sitting felt enormous. It was a reminder that the one person who might have stepped in was still somewhere on the other side of the manor, unaware that his absence had become part of the joke. I could have let it pass. I had let so many versions of this pass over the years. Letting it pass again would have been the easiest thing in the world, the well-worn groove my personality had been carved into. But something about doing it here, in front of 600 strangers, on the one day that was supposed to be mine, made the groove suddenly feel less like comfort and more like a cage I had built for myself out of other people's convenience. I set my napkin down on the table, slowly, and rose from my chair, standing there with 600 faces turned toward me and the string quartet frozen mid-phrase. I felt something settle in my chest that I did not immediately recognize. It took me a moment to understand what it was. It was not anger, exactly. though anger was somewhere in the mix. It was closer to clarity. The same feeling I got when a page I had been staring at for hours under magnification finally revealed the hairline tear I had been searching for the whole time. I had spent 29 years absorbing small cruelties from my own sister and calling it patience. I did not plan the words. I simply opened my mouth and let the truth walk out, calm and level. The same voice I used when explaining to a nervous donor that a 400-year-old manuscript couldn't be rushed, no matter how badly they wanted the restoration finished by a certain date. "Since we're being so honest tonight," I said, and my voice carried further than I expected across the quiet hall. "I think it's only fair I mention something too." Portia's smile flickered, uncertain, still holding the microphone stand like she assumed I was about to say something sentimental, something that would let her laugh it off and hand the moment back to her. "3 weeks ago," I continued, "a vendor called our mother looking for payment on an outstanding invoice, $11,000, for inventory Portia never paid for after her second boutique closed. Mom asked me to help quietly, and I did, because that's usually what happens in our family. Someone makes a mess, and I clean it up without being asked to take a bow for it." A collective intake of breath moved through the nearest tables, quiet but unmistakable. The sound 600 people make when they realize a story has just changed shape in front of them. "So when my sister calls my work small," I said, keeping my eyes on Portia, not raising my voice, not needing to, "I want everyone here to know that the hands she's mocking for repairing old paper were the ones that quietly fixed her business twice. I don't say that to embarrass her. I say it because if we're going to stand here and argue about who builds real things and who doesn't, the record should be accurate." I set the moment down gently, the way I set down anything fragile, and reached for my water glass, giving the room a place to exhale. It did not get the chance to exhale. Portia's face had gone through several colors in the space of a few seconds, landing finally on a deep, furious red that had nothing to do with the champagne. Her hand tightened around the microphone until her knuckles went pale. For a moment I actually believed she might simply walk off the small stage, humiliated but contained, the way I had contained every humiliation handed to me for the better part of 3 decades. She did not walk off the stage. She set the microphone down hard enough that it cracked against the wood with a sound that made half the room flinch, and she crossed the distance between us in 4 fast steps, her emerald dress snapping around her ankles. I saw my mother half rise from her chair. I saw my father's hand shoot out too late to stop anything. I registered, somewhere at the very edge of my vision, 600 faces turning toward us in unison, the way a field of grass turns all at once when the wind changes. I did not step back. I do not know, even now, whether that was courage or simply disbelief. The particular kind of frozen stillness that comes from watching something happen that your mind has not yet agreed is real. "You have humiliated me my entire life just by existing," Portia said, her voice raw, stripped of the polished toast-giving cadence from minutes earlier, closer now to something that had clearly been building for years and had finally found its exit. "You always have to be the better one, don't you, even today, even at your own wedding? You couldn't just let me have one moment." "Portia," I started, my hand lifting instinctively, not to strike, only to steady whatever was happening between us. "That's not what I meant. I only wanted people to know the truth." "I never wanted— You never want anything," she cut in, her voice cracking down the middle, half fury and half something that sounded almost like grief. "That's the problem, Eleanor. You never want anything. You never ask for anything. You just sit there being quiet and patient and good, and somehow, that always makes the rest of us look worse. Do you know what it's like to grow up next to someone who makes not wanting things look like a virtue? I did not have an answer ready. I had spent so many years being the daughter nobody worried about that I had never once considered the possibility that my own restraint had been a weapon in someone else's story, one I had never meant to wield. Behind Portia, I could see our mother moving between the tables, her mouth already forming my sister's name, too far away to reach us in time. My father had risen fully out of his chair now, his face drained of color, watching the two of us the way a man watches a structure he built begin to lean. The band had stopped entirely. Even the servers along the back wall had gone still. Trays balanced and forgotten. 600 people held their breath waiting to see what would happen next. And for one suspended second, nothing did. Then Portia's hand moved. Then Portia's hand moved. I did not see it coming the way people in movies always seem to see a slap coming, some instinctive flinch that lets them brace. I felt it before I understood it. Her open palm caught the side of my face with a crack that seemed to echo off the restored oak beams above us. It was sharp enough that for a full second, the entire room disappeared into a burst of white static behind my eyes. I registered the sting before the sound, and then the sound arrived a half beat later, louder than I would have imagined a single hand could be. The impact turned my head. My ears filled with a high, thin ringing. I stumbled sideways. One hand flew out to catch the edge of the head table but landed on the linen tablecloth instead, dragging a champagne flute down with me. It shattered against the marble floor somewhere near my feet, though I barely registered the sound over the ringing in my skull. 600 guests did not gasp the way I would have expected. For one terrible, suspended moment, nobody made any sound at all. Then the whispering started, quiet and fast, spreading table to table the way fire finds dry grass. A few people near the back, too far away to understand what they had just watched, actually laughed. It was a nervous, confused sound, the kind people make when they are not sure whether they are allowed to be horrified yet. I heard someone near the third table say the word unbelievable, not with sympathy, more with the flat curiosity of a person watching a car accident unfold from a safe distance. I heard someone else, a man I did not recognize, mutter to his companion that he had never seen anything like it at a wedding. The casual way he said it, as if filing the moment away to tell later, made the humiliation cut even deeper than the slap itself had. My mother had risen fully out of her chair, both hands pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a horror that, even then, felt oddly performative, as though part of her was already rehearsing how she would describe this to her friends. My father had not moved at all. He stood frozen beside his chair, his face the color of old paper. He stared at Portia with an expression I could not read, caught between disbelief and a fear that had nothing to do with me. I straightened myself with one hand still braced on the table, my cheek already pulsing with heat, my vision swimming back into focus one careful degree at a time. I could feel a stinging warmth just beneath my eye, where her ring had caught skin, and when I touched 2 fingers to the spot they came away faintly red. Portia stood frozen where she had struck me, her hand still raised, her mouth slightly open, as though even she had not fully believed her own body would go through with it until it already had. The rage that had carried her across the stage had drained out of her face entirely, replaced by something closer to horror. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice had gone very small, almost childlike. I did not answer her. I could not have found words in that moment if I had wanted to. It was not because I was too devastated to speak, but because something in me had gone very still and very clear, the same stillness I felt when I discovered a tear in a manuscript so severe that any wrong movement could cost the whole page. I understood in that stillness that whatever I said next would be remembered by 600 people for the rest of their lives, and I intended to choose it carefully. I lifted my hand and wiped the single tear that had escaped down my cheek, more from the shock of impact than from sorrow. My fingers came away smudged with the faint red of a shallow cut. I did not sob. I did not run. I simply stood there in my ivory dress in the middle of the great hall, my sister's handprint rising on my face in front of everyone who had ever known either of us, and I let the silence stretch as long as it needed to stretch. For a strange, suspended second, I thought about the ledger waiting for me back at the conservation lab, the one I had left half-finished that morning, its torn spine held together with careful strips of Japanese tissue. I thought about how patient I had learned to be with fragile things, how many hours I had spent coaxing brittle paper back into a shape that could survive being touched again. I had never once, in 10 years of that work, considered that the same patience I gave so freely to 200-year-old documents was patience I had never once demanded for myself. 29 years of making myself smaller so that a room could stay comfortable, and here was the room, entirely uncomfortable anyway, staring back at me in silence. Somewhere near the stage, Portia had not lowered her hand. She stood with her palm still faintly raised, as if her own arm had not yet caught up to what it had done, her face draining of color one shade at a time. I watched her lips move, forming my name again, no sound behind it this time. That was the exact moment the side door near the garden entrance opened. Julian walked in. He did not rush. That was the first thing I registered through the ringing in my ears, that he crossed the threshold at exactly the same unhurried pace he used for everything. The same pace he used pouring coffee in the morning or reading a menu he had already memorized. He must have heard the commotion from the garden cottage, or perhaps someone had run to fetch him the moment the slap landed. But whatever had brought him here, he did not look like a man reacting to a crisis. He looked like a man arriving exactly where he intended to be. His eyes found me first. I watched something move across his face, quick and controlled, a flash of something sharper than anger before it settled back into stillness. Then his gaze moved past me, toward Portia, toward my parents, sweeping the room once, slow and complete. The way you check a structure for damage before deciding how to proceed. I do not know which guest reacted first. I have replayed that moment so many times since that the order of it has blurred into something closer to instinct than memory. I remember a man near the third table, someone I recognized only vaguely as one of my father's long-time business contacts, going rigid in his seat, his wineglass frozen halfway to his mouth. I remember him leaning toward the woman beside him and saying a single word, low, urgent, disbelieving. Kane. It should not have meant anything. It was simply Julian's last name, the one printed on our wedding invitations, the one I had said out loud 100 times over the past year without anyone in that room reacting to it at all. I had introduced him to my own book club as Julian, my fiancé who works in supply chain, and watched people nod politely and move on to the next topic. I had never once seen a stranger's face change at the sound of his name, the way this man's face had just changed, like a door swinging open onto a room he had not expected to exist. Later, I would learn who he was, that man at the third table, Later, I would learn his firm had spent the better part of 2 years trying to secure a credit line from Kane Meridian Capital for a regional distribution expansion. He had sat across a negotiating table from Julian exactly once, 8 months earlier, in a conference room with no windows and no small talk, and had walked out of that meeting having learned more about discipline than in 20 years of running his own company. He had not expected to see that same quiet, unassuming man standing in the middle of a wedding reception in a rented tuxedo. And he certainly had not expected to see him a moment after watching a bride get struck across the face by her own sister. But the woman beside him turned pale and stood up from her chair without seeming to decide to. 2 tables over. Another man rose as well, adjusting his jacket with the automatic reflex of someone suddenly aware he was in the presence of something larger than a wedding reception. It moved through the hall like a current, finding the quickest path to ground, moving table by table and guest by guest. Strangers straightened in their seats, voices fell, and some went quiet for no visible reason, as if the air itself had lost pressure. I did not understand what was happening. I only knew it was happening. That some current I couldn't reach was running under the surface of my wedding, moving through people who clearly knew things about the man I'd just married that I did not. Julian reached me in a few unhurried strides and stopped close enough that I could smell the cedar and clean linen scent I associated with him. He stood so near he blocked most of the room from my line of sight. He did not ask if I was all right in front of everyone. He simply lifted 2 fingers, gentle, to the side of my face near the cut beneath my eye. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at what he found there. "I'm here," he said, quiet enough that it was meant only for me, though the hall had gone so silent by then that I suspected at least the front tables heard it anyway. Behind him, the murmuring had not stopped. If anything, it had grown, spreading to the tables that had not seen the slap at all. People turned to their neighbors, asking what was happening, why half the room had gone still, why a man they had assumed was simply the groom, pleasant and quiet and forgettable, stood in the center with an authority that made grown executives rise from their chairs without being asked. I looked past Julian's shoulder at my mother, who was staring at the scene with an expression I had never seen on her before. Confusion layered over something closer to fear. I looked at my father, and found him already looking at Julian, his face the color of old parchment, his mouth slightly open as though he had started to say something and thought better of it. 600 guests had come to watch me get married. In the space of perhaps 90 seconds, every one of them had gone completely, uniformly silent, and not one of them, I would learn later, was silent because of the slap anymore. Julian did not raise his voice once. He turned his head slightly toward the estate's event coordinator, a woman named Rosa who had spent the entire afternoon hovering near the stage with a clipboard, and gave her a single small nod. I do not know what passed between them in that gesture, but within seconds the string quartet lifted their instruments again, launching into something soft and instrumental. A deliberate wash of sound meant to fill the silence and give 600 people somewhere else to direct their attention. Servers resumed moving between tables. Conversation slowly, unevenly, began to knit itself back together at the edges of the room, though I could feel eyes still tracking us from every direction. "Let's step outside," Julian said, his hand settling at the small of my back, light enough that I could have pulled away if I wanted to, steady enough that I understood he would not let go until I was somewhere safer than the center of that hall. He did not look at Portia. He did not look at my parents, He walked me toward the side door he had come through, his pace unhurried even now, as though hurrying would have given the room something more interesting to watch than it already had. Behind us. I heard my mother's voice rise for the first time, sharp with confusion rather than concern, calling out to no one in particular, asking what on earth was happening, why everyone had gone so strange all at once. I glanced back once and saw her standing beside Portia, one hand on my sister's arm, both of them staring after Julian and me with matching expressions of bewilderment. Two women who had spent the last 5 minutes certain they understood exactly what kind of crisis this was, only to discover, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, that they did not understand it at all. My father had not moved from where he stood near the head table. I caught his eye just before the side door closed behind us, and what I saw there was not confusion. It was recognition, quick and total, gone again almost before I could be sure I had seen it, replaced by something that looked very much like dread. I filed that expression away too, the way I had filed away his checked watch that morning and his strange toast an hour earlier. Another small inconsistency in a day that was already collecting far too many of them. I did not have time to wonder about that expression. Not yet, not with my cheeks still throbbing and my thoughts still scattered from the impact. And Julian's hand steady against my back, guiding me down a quiet stone corridor lined with old estate portraits toward the cooler air of the garden beyond. The corridor was original to the manor, its walls hung with oil paintings of long-dead owners in stiff formal dress. Their painted eyes seemed to track us as we passed, silent witnesses to a scene none of them could have imagined when they sat for their portraits over a century ago. My heels clicked unevenly against the stone floor. My balance was not entirely recovered, and Julian slowed his pace to match mine without a word, the way he did most things, adjusting himself around me before I even had to ask. Portia had not followed us. I learned later that she stood frozen at the edge of the stage for nearly a full minute after we left, staring at the door we had disappeared through, the weight of what she had just done finally beginning to register in a way it had not registered in the heat of the moment itself. She would tell me, weeks later, that watching those grown men rise out of their chairs for a man she had spent the last hour mocking, as unmemorable was the precise second she understood, with a sick, sliding certainty, that she had made a mistake far larger than a slap. She did not yet know how much larger. Neither did I. I did not know, walking down that quiet corridor with my new husband's hand steady against my spine, that the confusion I had just watched pass across my mother's face was not the confusion of a woman who had misjudged her younger daughter's temper. It was the confusion of a woman in a room she thought she knew, watching something change around her and unable to say why. I did not know that my father's expression, that flash of recognition followed by dread, was the first visible crack in a much larger and much older secret, one that had nothing to do with Portia at all. I only knew that my face hurt, that my new husband's hands were gentle, and that somewhere behind those heavy oak doors, 600 people were still trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. The corridor opened onto the estate's rose garden, the evening air cool against my flushed skin. The noise of the reception faded behind heavy oak doors that Rosa closed softly behind us. For the first time since the toast began, I felt my shoulders drop, my breath finally catching up to the last 5 minutes of my life. Julian turned to face me fully then, his hands framing my face with a gentleness that made the sting beneath my eye feel suddenly, absurdly far away. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and this time his voice carried none of the careful stillness he had used inside. It cracked, just slightly, on the second word. "I'm fine," I said, which was not entirely true, but felt truer than any other answer I could have given him in that moment. "It looks worse than it feels." Julian did not accept that easily. He guided me to a stone bench near the rose garden's center fountain, tilted my chin gently toward the last of the evening light, and studied the cut beneath my eye with the same careful attention he gave everything, the same attention that had made me fall for him in the first place. "It's shallow," he said finally, more to himself than to me. "It won't scar, but I want the doctor to look at it tonight anyway. Julian, it's a scratch. It's a scratch from your sister's ring, on your wedding day, in front of 600 people," he said. For the first time all evening, something dangerous flickered behind his usual composure. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He exhaled slowly and deliberately. I imagined he did that before every negotiation that mattered, resetting himself before continuing. "I'm not angry at you. I need you to know that. None of this is anything you did." I sat with that for a moment, listening to the fountain's low, steady sound. I let the cool evening air settle the last of the adrenaline still moving through my chest. "Everyone in that room looked at you like they'd seen a ghost," I said finally. "What was that?" He was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "Some people recognize me from work," he said. "It's not something I usually think about outside of work." It was not a full answer. Some part of me still registered it and filed it away beside my father's strange toast and stranger expression. Another loose thread in a day already unraveling faster than I could follow. But I was tired, and my face hurt, and I did not have the strength to pull on it yet. I let it rest the way I had let so many things in my life. I told myself I would return to it later, when I had the energy to hold it up to the light and look for the seams. The rose garden had gone fully dark by then, the last violet edge of sunset giving way to the soft amber glow of the lanterns strung along the pergola. Somewhere beyond the hedges, I could still hear the faint murmur of the reception. Glasses clinking. The quartet was playing something upbeat now, as though the entire hall had decided to move forward without asking either of us for permission. It struck me how easily a room could absorb a wound and keep functioning. 600 people returned to their salads and small talk once the immediate spectacle had passed. I did not resent them for it. I understood it. I had spent my whole life doing exactly what that room was doing now, folding disruption quietly back into the evening as though it had never happened. "I don't want to go back in there," I admitted, surprising myself with how small my voice sounded. "Not tonight. Not to finish a reception where my own sister just—" I stopped, unable to finish the sentence, the reality of it catching up to me all at once, the adrenaline finally giving way to something closer to grief. Julian took both of my hands in his, steady and warm against the evening chill. "Then we won't," he said simply. "We don't need 600 people to make this real. Eleanor, we only ever needed each other." He reached into his jacket and produced, of all things, a small leather notebook and a pen, the kind he always carried out of habit from years of jotting down figures he did not trust himself to remember. He tore a blank page free and held it out to me. "Write down whatever you want to promise me," he said. "I'll write down what I want to promise you. We'll say it to each other right here, under actual stars instead of chandeliers, and it will mean exactly as much as anything either of us could have said in front of a crowd." More. Probably. Nobody in that hall needs to witness this to make it true. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked into a room full of strangers, silenced it without raising his voice, and was now offering me a torn page and a fountain pen instead of a spectacle. Something in my chest, still raw from the slap, from the toast, from 29 years of shrinking myself smaller and smaller to keep the peace, finally loosened. "Okay," I said, and for the first time since the toasts began, I smiled. I took the pen and pressed it to the paper and found, to my own surprise, that the words came easily. None of the careful editing I usually applied to everything I said or wrote. I promised him the same patience I gave to fragile things, the kind that does not rush repair, the kind that trusts a wound will hold if you handle it gently enough. I promised him honesty, even when honesty cost me the comfort of staying small. Beside me, Julian wrote in quick, decisive strokes, the handwriting of a man who made large decisions quickly and rarely reconsidered them. And when he finished, he folded his page in half without showing me, the way I had folded mine. 2 private vows meant for exactly 2 people and no audience at all. We stood at the edge of the fountain as the lanterns flickered against the dark hedges, and we read our promises to each other under a sky just beginning to fill with stars, 3 days before either of us intended to make it legal in front of a courthouse clerk. And it felt, in that quiet garden, more like a real wedding than anything happening on the other side of the manor walls. We stayed in that garden for almost an hour, long after the last of the light had drained from the sky. We talked about nothing important, the way you talk when you are simply grateful to still have a voice worth using. Julian found a bottle of champagne one of the waitstaff had left chilling near the pergola, and we drank it straight from the bottle, passing it back and forth like teenagers, laughing quietly at how absurd the whole evening had become. My ivory dress stained faintly with grass at the hem, his rented tuxedo jacket draped over my shoulders against the evening chill. On the other side of the manor, I would learn later, the night had taken a very different shape. My father had spent the better part of that hour fielding phone calls he did not want to take in front of his remaining guests, stepping outside twice to pace the length of the courtyard. His voice low and clipped in a way none of the wedding photographers dared to point a camera toward. 2 of his longtime business associates, the ones who had risen from their chairs when Julian walked in, approached him separately before leaving early. Each asked some version of the same careful question: how long had he known his new son-in-law ran Kane Meridian Capital? And why had he never mentioned it? My father, I was told, had no answer that did not sound like a lie. Because the truth, whatever it actually was clearly not something he was prepared to share with anyone that night. My mother spent the hour trying to manage what was left of the reception, forcing brightness into her voice as she thanked departing guests. She kept one eye on Portia, who had retreated to a small sitting room off the main hall and refused to come out. When my mother finally coaxed the door open, she found my sister sitting on the floor with her back against a velvet armchair, mascara streaked down both cheeks, staring at nothing. Portia would not say much that night beyond the same 6 words, repeated over and over, quiet and stunned. I didn't know. She did not mean the slap. Even in her own shock, some part of my sister understood that the slap was the smallest piece of what had just happened in that hall. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was the scale of the man they had spent the last year quietly dismissing at family dinners, the one Portia had called unmemorable from a stage in front of 600 witnesses less than 2 hours earlier. I imagine, though I was not there to see it, that the sound of grown executives rising out of their chairs replayed in her mind on some kind of loop that night. each replay a little worse than the last. None of them yet understood what exactly. They didn't know. That understanding would take weeks to arrive in full, and it would not arrive gently. Julian and I did not go back inside. We left through the garden side gate sometime after 10. We slipped away from our own reception without saying goodbye to anyone, and climbed into the back of a car his driver had waiting at the edge of the property. I remember looking back once at the manor's glowing windows. The quartet's muffled music still played for whoever remained, and I felt something I hadn't expected on a night that had gone so badly wrong. I felt free, genuinely, unexpectedly free in a way I hadn't in 29 years of trying to make myself as small as possible in my own family. I did not know yet that the freedom would be short-lived. I didn't see that the quiet unraveling already happening behind those glowing windows, in a father's evasive phone calls and a mother's forced smiles, was only the first thread of something far larger. Julian and I were married in front of a courthouse clerk 3 days later, quietly, with only his best man and my closest colleague from the conservation lab as witnesses. It felt, strangely, more real than anything Ravenswood Manor could have offered us. We agreed to plan a second celebration eventually, something smaller, something entirely on our own terms, once the dust from the first one had settled. Neither of us could have guessed how much dust there still was left to settle, or how long it would take. For a few weeks after the wedding, life folded itself back into something almost ordinary. I returned to the conservation lab and finished the 1861 ledger I had left half repaired. Julian went back to his quiet, unglamorous cover story about supply chains, and neither of us spoke much about the reception, as though naming it too often might give it more power than it already had. My mother called twice a week, cheerful and evasive in equal measure. My father called almost never, which I told myself at the time was just Walter being Walter, a man who'd never been comfortable on the phone. 3 weeks later, back at my parents' house to collect the last boxes from my childhood bedroom, before moving fully into the life Julian and I were building together. I pulled an old shoebox from beneath my former bed. I expected nothing more than forgotten yearbooks and concert ticket stubs. I was not expecting to find my grandmother's name on a bank statement I had never seen before in my life. I want to be honest about something. For those 3 weeks after the wedding, I told myself the worst had already happened. A slap, a strange toast, and a room full of whispers felt like the full weight of whatever my family had been carrying without my knowledge. I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong in a way I could not have predicted. I knelt on the floor of my childhood bedroom with a decade of forgotten belongings spread around me, a bank statement bearing my late grandmother's handwriting resting in my hands like something that had been waiting to be found. I am a conservator. I spend my professional life reading the smallest details other people overlook, the watermark that reveals a forgery, the ink that dates a document to the wrong decade. I should have recognized, faster than I did, that some documents are kept in a shoebox under a bed for one reason only. Someone did not want them found. 3 weeks after the wedding, I drove back to my parents' house on a gray Saturday afternoon to finish packing up the last remnants of my childhood bedroom, a task I had been putting off since college, the kind of chore that felt too small to schedule and too large to ignore forever. My mother met me at the door with the particular brightness she reserved for visits, already talking before I had fully stepped inside, asking about the honeymoon we had not yet taken, asking whether the cut beneath my eye had healed properly, asking everything except the one question I kept waiting for and never received. Nobody in my family had directly mentioned the wedding since the wedding itself. It had become, in the space of 3 weeks, a subject we all silently agreed to route around. The way you root around a pothole you know is there without ever discussing repairing it. "Portia's not here," Diane said, following me up the stairs, answering a question I had not asked. "She's staying with a friend for a while, getting some space, processing everything. You understand, I did understand, or told myself I did." I had spent enough of my life managing my own reactions around my sister's feelings that giving her space to process her own guilt seemed, on the surface, like a reasonable use of everyone's energy. I did not examine too closely why it was always Portia who needed space and processing, while the rest of us were simply expected to continue functioning. My father was not home either, out at the plant on a Saturday, which my mother mentioned in the same breezy tone she used for everything lately, as though a weekend spent at a struggling family business were nothing more than an ordinary scheduling detail. I noticed the tone. I had been noticing a great many tones since the wedding, small inconsistencies collecting at the edges of my attention like dust I had not yet found the time to sweep away. My old bedroom had been converted, gradually and without much ceremony, into a general storage room over the years since I had moved out, its walls now lined with boxes of holiday decorations and an old treadmill nobody used. My childhood bed remained, though pushed into the corner beneath the window, still made with the same faded quilt my grandmother had sewn for me the year I turned 10. I worked through the closet first, sorting old clothes into donation piles, setting aside a handful of books I wanted to keep. My mother hovered in the doorway for a while, offering commentary on items I had forgotten I owned, a school play program here, a ribbon from a science fair there, narrating my own childhood back to me, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades curating which parts of our family history got remembered fondly and which parts got quietly folded away. Eventually her phone rang. Some committee matter from her garden club, and she drifted downstairs to take the call, leaving me alone with the quiet, dusty work of excavating my own past. The room smelled the way old rooms always smell, faintly of cedar and dust and the particular staleness of air that has not been disturbed in a long while. Afternoon light came in slanted through the same curtains that had hung there since I was 14. And for a moment, kneeling on the carpet sorting through the debris of childhood, I let myself feel something close to nostalgia. An ordinary Saturday spent tidying an ordinary past. It was nearly 4 o'clock when I knelt down to check beneath the bed, more out of habit than expectation. The kind of thoroughness that came naturally to someone who spent her professional life assuming nothing important stayed on the surface. My fingers found a shoebox pushed far back against the wall, its cardboard soft with age, its lid held on with a single rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped the moment I touched it. Inside, beneath a scattering of concert ticket stubs and a stack of birthday cards I vaguely remembered receiving, sat a thick rubber-banded bundle of papers, yellowed at the edges. The kind of paper that had clearly not seen daylight in years. I pulled it free and sat back against the bed frame. I unwound the second rubber band with the same careful patience I gave every fragile document that crossed my work table, an old habit of respect for paper that kept me from tearing into anything carelessly. I sorted through them the way I would sort through any collection of unfamiliar paper. I went quickly at first, then slower, my attention catching on the second and third pages like a fingertip on a raised thread in smooth fabric. There were statements from a regional trust account, dozens of them spanning what looked like years. They were interspersed with a handful of legal forms I recognized only vaguely from a business law course I had taken in college. The first page was a bank statement. The letterhead was unfamiliar. The account holder's name printed in small, precise type at the top, Margaret Voss, in care of Diane Voss, Custodian. I sat very still on the floor of my childhood bedroom. My grandmother's name stared back at me from a document I had never once been shown in 29 years of being told that her memory belonged, in some quiet, unspoken way, to me. I felt the first cold thread of something. I would spend the next several weeks slowly, methodically, pulling it all the way to its source, whether I wanted to or not. I did not tell my mother what I had found. I am still not entirely sure why. Some instinct, the same instinct that had kept me quiet through decades of small inconsistencies, told me to gather more information before I said a single word out loud. I slid the bundle of papers into my bag beneath a stack of old sweaters. I finished packing the rest of the room with a steadiness I did not actually feel, my hands moving through familiar motions, while my mind stayed fixed on the name printed at the top of that first page. At home that evening, in the small rented house Julian and I had moved into together rather than his much larger apartment downtown, a choice we had both made deliberately, wanting to build something ordinary before we built something grand. I spread the papers across our kitchen table and looked at them properly for the first time. The kitchen light was warm and yellow, the kind of ordinary domestic light that made the papers in front of me feel almost absurd by comparison, as though they belonged to some other, colder life I had accidentally carried in through the front door. I worked through them methodically, the way I would work through any damaged document, establishing a timeline before drawing a single conclusion. It was a discipline that had served me well for a decade of professional life, and it served me now, forcing my racing thoughts into some kind of order even as my hands, I noticed distantly, had begun to shake. The account had been opened when I was 8 years old, funded by an initial deposit of $340,000. According to the earliest statement in the bundle, my grandmother Margaret had died the following spring, and I remembered, distantly, some family conversation about an inheritance set aside for my education, a conversation that had happened over my head at an age when such things did not yet feel real to me. I had grown up believing, in the vague way children believe things adults tell them once and never repeat, that whatever my grandmother left me had gone toward my university tuition, spent responsibly, accounted for, done. The statements told a different story. The balance climbed steadily through my childhood, then plateaued through my college years, my tuition covered instead by a combination of scholarships and my own part-time work at the university archive, the very job that had eventually become my career. The account should have grown larger during those years, untouched, gathering interest. Instead, beginning the year I turned 23, the balance began a slow, steady decline that continued, statement after statement, year after year, in withdrawals of 10 and 15 and once, memorably, $40,000 at a time. I noticed, with the particular dread of someone assembling a pattern they do not want to see, that nearly every significant withdrawal lined up neatly against a date I could place, if I thought hard enough. 23 was the year Portia opened her first boutique. 25 was the year that boutique closed, and a second one opened 3 blocks away with a fresh coat of paint and a new business name. 27, another infusion, coinciding with what my mother had described at the time only as Portia needing a bridge while she found her footing. I had never once asked what bridge meant, or what it was built out of, or whose foundation had been quietly dismantled to supply the materials. Beneath the statements, near the bottom of the stack, I found a single sheet I recognized instantly, because I remembered signing it, a power of attorney form, dated the September I started college, granting my mother authority to manage assets held in my name. I remembered the moment vaguely. My mother had slid a clipboard across the kitchen table one hurried morning before orientation, telling me it was simply easier this way, that she would handle anything financial so I could focus on my studies. I remembered signing where she pointed without reading past the first paragraph. 19 years old and entirely unbothered by legal language, I assumed existed only to protect me. I sat at my own kitchen table 11 years later, staring at my own signature, young and looping and trusting, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. I thought about all the times over the years my mother had waved off any mention of the trust, always with the same soft, dismissive phrase. "It's all very boring, sweetheart. Nothing worth interrupting your day over." I understood then, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, that boring had simply been the word she used to keep me from ever looking closely enough to ask a second question. Julian found me there an hour later, still at the table. Papers fanned out in careful rows the way I organized anything I needed to understand fully, and he did not ask what was wrong right away. He simply set down his bag, pulled out the chair beside me, sat down, and began reading in silence, his expression shifting slowly from curiosity to something sharper and more focused, as the pattern in the numbers revealed itself to him the same unhurried way it had revealed itself to me. "Eleanor," he said quietly, after several minutes of silence broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages, "I think you need to see exactly how much of this is actually gone. All of it added together, not spread out across a decade where it's easy to lose track. We stayed at that kitchen table long after the light outside had gone fully dark, the overhead lamp casting a small warm circle around the papers while the rest of the house dimmed into shadow around us. Julian read through the statements twice, methodically, occasionally jotting a figure onto the back of an envelope, and I watched him do it with a strange, detached fascination, the way I imagined other people watched a surgeon work, aware that what I was seeing was a skill far beyond my own understanding, even as its results unfolded directly in front of me. "You said he does supply chain consulting," I said at one point, only half joking, needing somewhere to put the discomfort building in my chest. "Since when does supply chain consulting include reading 6 years of bank statements like a second language?" He looked up at me, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his usual composure, quick and complicated, gone before I could fully read it. "Old habit," he said simply. "I like numbers that tell the truth. It bothers me when they don't." I let it pass. I had let so many small oddities about Julian pass over the past year, not because I didn't notice them, but because I'd built my entire understanding of him around the idea that whatever he wasn't telling me, he'd tell me eventually, on his own time, and that pressing him would only teach him that my trust came with conditions. It was, I would come to realize later, exactly the same instinct that had let my own family get away with so much for so long. I was better at extending patience to other people than I was at questioning what that patience actually cost me, I thought, not for the first time since the wedding, about the way certain habits form so early and so quietly that you stop recognizing them as choices at all. I had learned to read a room for danger before I learned to read for pleasure. I had learned which questions made my mother's smile go tight at the corners. Long before I understood why it mattered, I had learned to simply stop asking them. Watching Julian now, deliberately withholding some piece of himself even as he offered me everything else, I felt an unfamiliar flicker of something almost like recognition. Perhaps we had both built our adult lives around careful omissions, just aimed in different directions. "I don't want to think the worst of my mother," I said, finally saying out loud the thing I had been circling since I found the shoebox. "There has to be an explanation. Maybe she was helping Portia through something I don't know about. Maybe there's a version of this where it makes sense." "There might be," Julian said carefully. And I appreciated, even in that moment, how deliberately he chose not to hand me a conclusion, how he seemed to understand that whatever verdict I eventually reached about my own mother needed to be mine and not his. "But you deserve to know the actual numbers before you decide how to feel about them. Guessing is worse than knowing, even when knowing is painful. You taught me that, actually, with your books. You never guess what a damaged page says. You find out." It was such a precise, careful thing to say, turning my own professional instincts back toward me at the exact moment I needed them most. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, the tight coil of dread easing just enough to let me breathe normally again. "I have people who do this," he continued, watching my face carefully as he said it, gauging how the offer would land. "Not anyone connected to the company directly. A small independent firm I use for personal matters. People who are very good at tracing exactly where money goes, and very discreet about what they find. I'm not suggesting this to build a case against your mother, Eleanor. I'm suggesting it because you deserve the truth laid out clearly, in a way that isn't buried under 30 pages of bank statements you have to decode after a full day of work." I looked at the papers spread across our table, at my own signature staring up from that decade-old power of attorney form, at the slow, patient decline of a number that had once represented my grandmother's love for me, translated into something practical and permanent. "Do it," I said, before I could talk myself out of it. Quietly. "And Julian, whatever they find, I want to see all of it, every number. I don't want you protecting me from it." He nodded once, solemn, and reached across the table to take my hand. His thumb traced slow circles against my knuckles, the way it did when he was choosing his next words with particular care. "I would never do that," he said. "You've spent your whole life being protected from things other people decided you couldn't handle. I'm not interested in becoming one more person who does that to you." We sat there a while longer, the papers still spread between us, neither of us in any hurry to move. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet again, and somewhere down the street a car door closed. Small, ordinary sounds from a small, ordinary evening that felt, in that moment, like they belonged to a different, gentler version of the day than the one I had actually lived. Julian gathered the statements into a neat stack and squared the edges the way I did when I finished handling a fragile document. He slid them carefully back inside the folder I had brought them home in, as though even he understood, without being told, that these particular pages deserved to be handled gently no matter how much damage the numbers inside them represented. While I waited to hear back from Julian's accountants, I could not stop myself from building my own version of the timeline. It was the same instinct that drove me to double-check every conservation report before submitting it, an inability to hand off a problem without first understanding its shape myself. I called the bank listed on the earliest statements, using my grandmother's account number and my own identification. After 20 minutes on hold and 2 transfers to different departments, a patient representative agreed to email me copies of statements going back further than the ones I had found in the shoebox, filling in gaps the physical papers had left behind. I spent an entire Sunday afternoon at our kitchen table, the same table where Julian and I had sat together days earlier. laying printed pages end to end across the surface like a woman assembling a manuscript from scattered, water-damaged fragments. I matched dates, matched figures, building something whole out of something someone had clearly hoped would stay fragmented forever. By the time I finished, the picture in front of me was undeniable. The trust my grandmother had established for me, $340,000 at its peak, now held just over $41,000. Over 6 years, in a steady, patient rhythm that only revealed itself when you set every withdrawal beside every other withdrawal. Someone had moved nearly the entire balance out of an account that belonged, on paper and in law, to me. I noted each withdrawal on a fresh legal pad, the way I catalogued condition issues on a manuscript before beginning any treatment, because a problem written down in my own handwriting always felt more real to me than a problem simply observed. 10,000 here, described on an accompanying memo line as inventory support. 15,000 there, marked family loan, though no corresponding repayment ever appeared anywhere in 6 years of records. The single $40,000 withdrawal I had noticed earlier sat alone in its own month, unexplained by any memo at all, as though whoever authorized it had simply run out of euphemisms by then. I sat back in my chair and stared at the numbers for a long time. I felt less like a wronged daughter in that moment, and more like the professional I had trained myself to be. Cataloging damage with a steady hand, because a shaking one only made repairs harder. Whether the object in front of you was 300 years old or simply hundreds of thousands of dollars short of what it should have been, it was easier, somehow, to hold the number itself than to hold what the number meant, that my own mother had watched me struggle through part-time work and scholarship applications during college, praising my independence, calling me resourceful, while quietly funding my sister's repeated failures with money that had my name on it the entire time. I thought about the conversations I now understood differently, my mother telling me, more than once, how proud she was that I never asked the family for anything, how refreshing it was that I had never developed Portia's expensive tastes. I had absorbed those comments as compliments for years. Small proof that I was the responsible daughter, the one who did not need managing. I understood now that those comments had been something else entirely. They had been a quiet cover story. Praise placed at the exact moments I might have asked where my grandmother's money had gone. I had not expected that particular kind of grief. It was sharper than the ordinary grief of simply losing the money. It was the grief of realizing my reliability, the trait I was proudest of, had been used against me for years, and turned into the very tool that made the theft easier rather than harder to commit. I thought about every family gathering where Portia's newest venture dominated the conversation, and every holiday when I quietly absorbed the news of another investment or rebrand or fresh start. I had nodded along, asked supportive questions, and never once suspected my own inheritance was the invisible engine funding each new attempt. I had spent years being generous with my attention in a house that was busy being far less generous with the truth. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted toward evening without my noticing, the kitchen slowly filling with the long amber shadows that meant Julian would be home within the hour. I found myself grateful, suddenly and fiercely, that I would not have to sit with this alone for much longer. I did not cry. I have never been someone who cries easily, and my family often took that as evidence I did not feel things as deeply as they did. The truth was that I processed things differently, slower and more methodically, with the grief arriving eventually rather than all at once. Usually long after everyone else had assumed the moment had passed me by. Instead, I gathered the printed statements into a single organized folder, the way I organized everything, and labeled the tab in small, careful handwriting like I did for acquisition files at the lab. I sat with my hand on top of it for several minutes before finally picking up my phone. I did not call to accuse. I told myself that, over and over, rehearsing the opening lines the way I once rehearsed presentations to skeptical donors. I called because I wanted, for the first time in 29 years, to ask my own mother a direct question and refused to accept a vague answer in return. I waited until Saturday, and I asked her to meet me for coffee at a small cafe near her house, deliberately choosing neutral ground, a place with other people around us, tables close enough together that whatever happened between us would have some natural boundary on it, some pressure to remain composed. She arrived 10 minutes late, apologizing about traffic and settling into the chair across from me with the easy warmth she always carried into our meetings. She asked about Julian and whether I had finally taken time off to rest after the wedding chaos. I let her finish, let her order her tea, and let the small talk run its course. Because part of me wanted to give her every chance to tell the truth before I had to lay it out in front of her. I had brought the folder with me, tucked inside my bag beneath a book I had no intention of reading, and I could feel its presence the entire time we exchanged pleasantries. A quiet, patient waiting for the moment I finally decided to bring it out into the light. Part of me still hoped, foolishly, that I would not need it at all, that my mother would simply tell me the truth unprompted the moment I raised the subject, sparing us both the indignity of documents laid out on a cafe table like evidence in a trial neither of us had wanted to attend. "I found the papers in my old room," I said finally, once her tea had arrived and the waiter had stepped away. "Grandma Margaret's trust. I know how much was in it, and I know how much is in it now." The change in her face was immediate and unmistakable, a flicker of something sharp behind her eyes before it smoothed itself back into practiced calm. It was the same kind of composure I had watched her deploy at countless family functions over the years, the ability to receive difficult news in public and keep her expression pleasant regardless of what she felt underneath it. "Eleanor, sweetheart," she said, reaching for her tea, not quite meeting my eyes. "That's such old paperwork. I don't even know why you'd be digging through that now." I wasn't digging. I was packing up my old room, and I found a shoebox under my bed that I don't remember putting there myself. I kept my voice level, the same voice I used with a nervous donor, the same voice I had used at my own wedding reception weeks earlier when I finally stopped absorbing quietly and started asking questions out loud. "Mom, the trust had $340,000 in it. It has $41,000 now. I need you to explain that to me." She set her tea down carefully, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring out the cafe window at the ordinary Saturday traffic passing by, and I watched her decide, in real time, which version of the truth she was going to offer me. "I was helping your sister," she said finally, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "You know how hard it's been for her, trying to get her businesses off the ground. You never needed help like that. Eleanor, you always had your job, your stability. You never once asked me for anything." "That's not an answer, Mom. That's a reason. I'm asking how you justified taking money that had my name on it and giving it to someone else without ever telling me." "I was going to tell you eventually," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, I could see she did not fully believe them either. It never felt like the right time. And honestly, Eleanor, you never needed it. You have never needed anything from this family. Portia needed it. I sat with that sentence for a long moment, turning it over, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that my mother was not describing a mistake. She was describing a philosophy, One she had apparently held for years without ever once questioning whether it was fair. Whether a decade of quietly funding one daughter's repeated failures with the other daughter's inheritance was something a person could simply excuse by calling it help. I needed it too, Mom, I said quietly. I just never asked. There's a difference. She did not have a response to that, not right away. She looked down at her tea, both hands wrapped around the cup as though she needed something warm to hold on to. And for a moment I saw something on her face that looked almost like genuine confusion, as if the idea that quiet, capable Eleanor might have had needs at all was a possibility she had never seriously entertained. It was almost worse than if she had simply lied to my face. A lie would have meant she understood what she had done and was trying to hide it. This felt like something closer to a blind spot so old and so deeply worn into her thinking that she could not see around it, even now, sitting across from the evidence of exactly what it had cost me. I don't expect you to fix this today, I said, gathering my composure, folding my hands on the table the way I did when a difficult conversation with a donor needed a firm, clear close. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know. I have documentation, Mom, all of it, and I need some time to decide what I'm going to do with that. The independent accounting firm Julian used was a small, discreet practice occupying 2 unremarkable floors in a mid-rise office building. It took 11 days to complete their review. Their lead analyst was Priya, a soft-spoken woman who had spent 20 years tracing the quiet financial movements my family specialized in. She called me directly instead of routing the results through Julian, a small courtesy I appreciated more than I expected. I want to walk you through this carefully, she said, once we were both settled with the report open in front of us, mine printed and spread across the kitchen table, hers presumably displayed on some screen in her own office. Because the numbers are clear, but I know that doesn't always make hearing them easier. Over the following 40 minutes, she laid out what her team had found with the same patient, methodical clarity I recognized from my own work, building a case one confirmed transaction at a time rather than leaping toward conclusions. She had annotated the entire 6-year history in a spreadsheet color-coded by destination account, and even hearing it described over the phone, I could picture exactly the kind of document it must have been, precise and damning in equal measure. Every significant withdrawal from my grandmother's trust, without exception, had ultimately landed in an account belonging to Portia, sometimes directly, sometimes routed first through my mother's personal checking account before being transferred onward within a matter of days. Priya suspected that small buffer had less to do with strategy and more to do with an old habit of managing money quietly, moving funds through familiar channels rather than drawing attention to their destination. There was no promissory note anywhere in the paper trail, no repayment schedule, no interest accrued or expected. Not a single document existed anywhere establishing these transfers as loans in any formal sense, despite the word loan appearing, informally, in several of the memo lines, as though someone had wanted the appearance of structure without ever intending to be bound by it. In plain terms, Priya said, your mother held what's called a fiduciary duty as custodian of that trust. That means she was legally obligated to manage it in your best interest, not anyone else's. What we're looking at here doesn't just look like poor judgment. It looks like a sustained breach of that duty, repeated over roughly 6 years. I sat with the word breach for a moment, turning it over the way I turned over any unfamiliar term, before deciding how much weight to give it. It sounded so clinical, so removed from the actual texture of what had happened, a mother quietly funneling her own daughter's inheritance toward her favored daughter's failed ventures, year after year, never once circling back to explain herself unless directly confronted at a cafe table on a Saturday afternoon. "What are my options?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "Legally, I mean, not what I should do emotionally. I haven't figured that part out yet. I just want to understand what's actually possible." Priya walked me through it patiently. I could pursue formal legal action against my mother for breach of fiduciary duty, which would likely recover at least a portion of the missing funds through the courts. The process would be slow, public in ways that might reach beyond our family, and would almost certainly end whatever relationship remained between us. Or I could pursue a quieter path, making a formal demand for restitution and an immediate revocation of the power of attorney, handled through private counsel rather than open litigation. That would preserve at least the possibility of eventual repair while making unmistakably clear that the behavior could never continue unaddressed. I thanked her and told her I needed a few days to think. I hung up the phone feeling strangely calm, calmer than I had been at any point since finding that shoebox under my childhood bed. Sitting there with the full weight of the evidence finally laid out in front of me, I understood exactly which version of justice I wanted. It was not the version that burned everything down. It was the version that made the truth undeniable and let the people who had caused it decide, for the first time, how they wanted to live inside that truth. Julian came home to find me sitting at the table with the report squared neatly in front of me, and he did not ask what I had decided right away. He simply made us both tea, sat down across from me, and waited. The same patience he always offered, letting me arrive at my own conclusions in my own time rather than rushing to hand me his. It was, I thought, exactly the opposite of how my own family had always operated, where decisions about my life were so often made quietly on my behalf, explained to me only afterward, if they were explained at all. "I want a lawyer," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Not to destroy her, to end the uncertainty. I want the power of attorney revoked, formally, in writing, and I want whatever can still be recovered. But I don't want to drag this into open court if I can avoid it. Not yet, and maybe not ever, depending on how she responds once the paperwork is in front of her." Julian nodded slowly, turning his mug between his hands. "That sounds like exactly the right instinct," he said. "Justice doesn't always have to be loud to be real. The lawyer's letter went out on a Tuesday. My mother called me within the hour, her voice tight and shaking in a way I had rarely heard from her. She asked me to come over, just the two of us, before I did anything else. Before I made any final decisions about lawyers or courts or anything with the word formal attached to it, I went. I told myself I went because I owed her one honest conversation before letting attorneys speak for both of us. A smaller, more honest part of me admitted I also went because some fragile hope still lived in me that this could end differently than the cold, procedural path I had already set into motion. I drove the familiar route to my parents' house with the radio off, rehearsing nothing, which was unusual for me. Every other difficult conversation of my adult life, I had scripted in advance, anticipated every possible response, prepared myself the way I prepared for a delicate restoration, accounting for every variable before ever touching the material. This time I arrived with nothing prepared at all, because I genuinely did not know which version of my mother I was about to meet. She met me at the door with her eyes already red, and she did not offer tea this time, did not perform the careful hospitality she usually wrapped around difficult conversations. She simply led me to the living room, sat down across from me, and, for the first time in my entire life, looked genuinely, completely undone. "I need you to understand something," she said, her hands twisting together in her lap. "It was never that I loved you less. Eleanor, I need you to hear that clearly before anything else." "Then explain it to me," I said, "because from where I'm sitting, love and action aren't the same thing. And for 6 years, your actions said something very different from what you're telling me now." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its usual polish, stripped down to something rawer and more honest than I had heard from her in years. "You were always fine," she said. "Do you understand what that's like, as a mother, to have one daughter who is always fine? You got yourself through school. You found a career you loved. You never called me in a panic about rent or a failed relationship or a business that wasn't working. And Portia called me in a panic about something every few months, and I couldn't just watch her fail. I couldn't. So you decided my fine meant I didn't need anything," I said. "That being capable meant I didn't deserve the same protection you gave her?" She flinched at that. It was a small recoil, like I'd said something she hadn't allowed herself to say, even in her own head. "It wasn't a decision," she said. "Not one decision, anyway. It was 100 small ones, over years, and each one felt reasonable at the time. You have to understand, Eleanor, when you have 2 children and one is drowning while the other manages on her own, you don't spend your energy on the one who's swimming. You just don't. I didn't think the one who was swimming still needed to be told she mattered, too. I didn't need to be told I mattered with money." "Mom," I said, my voice cracking slightly despite every effort to keep it level. "I needed you to actually see me. There's a difference between funding someone and seeing them. For 6 years you did neither for me. You just assumed I was fine because I never made you look at me long enough to notice otherwise." "I told myself you'd understand eventually," she said. And there were tears now, real ones, sliding down her face without the performance I had grown so used to watching her deploy at family gatherings. "I told myself the money would still be there when you actually needed it, that I'd find a way to make it right before it mattered. And then it kept not being the right time, and Portia kept needing more, and I just kept telling myself, Eleanor doesn't need this the way she needs it. Eleanor will be fine." "I am not fine right now, Mom," I said quietly, and the words landed with a weight I had not expected them to carry. 29 years of quietly being fine finally cracking open in a single sentence. "I have not been fine about this since I found that shoebox. I just didn't know how to say it. Saying it has never been something this family let me do." My mother put her face in her hands, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all. The only sound in the room was the quiet, broken rhythm of a woman finally hearing out loud the true cost of a decision she'd spent 6 years calling love in a different shape. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were swollen, her carefully maintained composure gone entirely. "What do you want from me, Eleanor?" she asked. And it did not sound like a challenge this time. It sounded like a genuine question, from a woman who had spent so many years managing her daughter's feelings that she seemed to have lost track of how to simply ask one of them what she needed. "I want the power of attorney gone," I said. "Today, in writing. I want whatever can still be recovered, put on a real repayment schedule this time, with proper documentation. And I want you to stop telling yourself that loving Portia required taking from me. Those were never the only 2 options. Mom, you just never made yourself look for a third one." She nodded, slowly, and did not argue. And something in that alone told me she finally understood, at least in that moment, the actual shape of what she had done. My mother signed the paperwork revoking the power of attorney within the week, quietly and without further argument. She hired her own attorney to draft a modest but real repayment schedule, the first documented promise anyone in my family had made about that money in 6 years. I want to be fair and say that much for her. Once the truth was fully in front of her, she did not fight it. My father was a different matter entirely. He called me 2 days after my conversation with Diane, his voice carrying an edge I rarely heard from him, somewhere between defensive and frightened, though I could not yet tell which emotion was driving the other. Your mother told me what happened, he said, without any greeting first. I think you're being harder on her than she deserves. Eleanor. She was trying to hold this family together the best way she knew how. She was stealing from me, Dad, I said. For 6 years. I don't know how else to describe holding a family together. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. It's complicated, he said finally, his voice quieter now. Family finances always are. I'd rather you let this stay between you and your mother. Don't go digging any further into it than you already have. The comment landed strangely. A small, specific wrongness, and I found myself turning it over the way I'd been turning over every inconsistency I'd collected since my wedding day. Don't dig any further. Not stay out of it. Not this doesn't concern you, but don't dig any further, as though he assumed correctly that digging was exactly what I intended to do, and wanted, urgently, to discourage it before it started. Why would there be anything further to dig into? I asked carefully. There isn't, he said, too quickly. I just mean, this is your mother's mistake to fix. Not something you need to turn into a bigger investigation. Let her make it right in her own way. I did not push further in that conversation. I had learned over the past several weeks that pushing too hard too fast tended to make people retreat rather than open up. Some instinct told me my father was not yet ready to be pushed, but I noted the conversation carefully. The same way I noted everything now, adding it to a growing list of small inconsistencies surrounding him specifically, a list that had started with a checked watch on my wedding morning and a strange, hollow toast about legacy and protecting things at cost, and had grown quietly ever since. I thought, too, about something my mother had said in an unguarded moment during our second conversation, something about your father needing a bridge for the business more than once over the years, offered almost as an aside, and I found myself wondering, for the first time, whether the plant he so carefully avoided discussing was carrying troubles of its own, entirely separate from anything Portia had ever touched. I let the thought sit for the time being. I had enough in front of me already, a mother's paperwork to finalize, a sister's indignation to absorb, a marriage barely 2 months old that still deserved more of my attention than I had been able to give it lately. Whatever my father was avoiding could wait its turn. Portia's reaction, when she finally resurfaced after weeks of staying with a friend, was its own kind of revelation. She showed up at my house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, and instead of the guilt or shame I had half expected, I found something closer to indignation waiting on my doorstep. You didn't have to go to a lawyer, she said, before I had even fully opened the door. That's so extreme, Eleanor. This is a family matter, like you're acting like Mom robbed a bank. She took nearly $300,000 that belonged to me and gave it to you, I said. I don't know what else to call that except exactly what it was. Portia's jaw tightened, and for a moment I watched her search for some version of the conversation where she was not, in fact, the beneficiary of 6 years of quiet theft. "I didn't ask her to do that," she said finally, which was, I noted, not actually a denial of anything. "No," I agreed. "But you never asked where the money was coming from either. Not once, in 6 years. I think you already knew better than to ask." Portia did not have an answer for that. She stood in my doorway for a long moment, arms crossed, her indignation slowly draining into something quieter and less certain. For the first time since the wedding, I saw a flicker of the sister I remembered from childhood underneath all the polish and performance. A girl who had learned, just as thoroughly as I had, to survive inside our family's particular arrangement of favor and neglect, only in the opposite direction. It did not make the 6 years of missing money any less real. For one brief moment she was less of a villain in my mind and more of a second casualty of the same quiet system that had shaped us both in mirrored, unequal ways. "I'm not trying to destroy you," I said, my voice softening despite myself. "I'm trying to make sure this never happens to either of us again, in either direction. That means you need to pay attention to where things come from. Portia, not just me." She did not respond to that either. She simply nodded once and left without another word. I stood in my own doorway for a long time after the door closed, wondering how much of my family's dysfunction I had spent my whole life mistaking for simple bad luck. The formal paperwork was finalized on a rainy Thursday afternoon in a conference room that felt deliberately unremarkable. Plain carpet, a plain table, and a box of tissues sat within reach that nobody, in the end, needed. My mother signed each page slowly, her handwriting less steady than usual. Her attorney read the terms aloud one final time for the record, the power of attorney permanently revoked. A documented repayment schedule spanning 4 years, quarterly statements to be sent directly to me going forward. No exceptions, no informal adjustments made without my written consent. It was, in the end, a far quieter ending than the discovery itself had promised. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Only 2 women and 2 attorneys and a stack of paper finally saying, in plain legal language, what should have been true all along. I did not gloat. I should be honest about that. Because there was a version of this conversation I could have had, one where I made her sit with every ounce of humiliation the situation deserved. And some small wounded part of me had wanted exactly that in the days right after finding the shoebox. But sitting across that plain table, watching a woman who had spent my entire childhood managing every room she entered, finally look small and uncertain in one, I found I did not actually want to make her smaller than she already felt. I wanted the truth documented. I wanted the theft to stop being invisible. I did not need her destroyed to feel like the scales had finally been set right. My attorney, a calm, unflappable woman named Denise who had handled disputes far messier than mine, had warned me beforehand that this restraint was rarer than people assumed. Most of her clients, she said, wanted blood by the time paperwork reached this stage. They wanted the other party to suffer visibly, publicly, proportionally. I had told her honestly that I did not know yet what I wanted, only that I did not want to become someone who needed another person's suffering to feel whole again. Watching my mother's hand shake slightly as she signed the final page, I understood that I had made the right choice, even if some part of me still ached with everything 6 years of silence had cost. "I know this doesn't fix everything," she said afterward, as we stood in the hallway outside the conference room, both of us drained in the particular way that only difficult, necessary conversations leave you drained. I know an apology doesn't undo 6 years. No, I agreed. But it's a start. I'm not asking you to fix it today. I'm asking you to actually see me from now on. That's all I ever really wanted. Mom, not the money, just to be seen the same way she was. She nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she reached out and hugged me without performing it for an audience, without a photographer nearby, without anyone watching who needed to see a certain version of our family projected outward. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain. The kind of repair that takes years rather than afternoons, but a beginning nonetheless. I let myself hold on to that small mercy on the drive home, choosing, for one evening at least, to believe that the hardest conversation of my adult life was finally behind me, rather than simply the first of several still waiting. That evening, back home, Julian found me curled on the couch with a cup of tea I had let go cold, staring at nothing in particular, turning over everything the past several weeks had taught me about my own family, about how long a person can live inside a pattern without ever naming it, simply because naming it feels more disruptive than living quietly within its walls. "You did the hard part," he said, sitting down beside me, pulling my feet into his lap the way he always did when he wanted me to actually relax instead of simply agreeing to try. "The rest is just logistics now." I wanted to believe him. Some tired, hopeful part of me did believe him, at least for that one quiet evening. Before I let myself remember the strange, clipped edge in my father's voice on the phone days earlier. "Don't go digging any further than you already have." I set my cold tea down on the coffee table and told Julian about the phone call, the specific wording of it, the way my father had reached for "don't dig any further" instead of any of the dozen gentler phrases he could have chosen. Julian listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, considering. "That's a strange thing to say," he said finally. "If there's genuinely nothing else to find." I nodded slowly, the same thought having occurred to me more than once over the past several days, though I had not yet let myself sit with it for very long. My mother's confession had been so total, so complete, that some part of me had assumed the worst of my family's secrets had already surfaced, that whatever came next would simply be logistics, repayment schedules and quarterly statements, and the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. I still did not know that night exactly what I would eventually find if I kept digging. I only knew, watching the rain streak down our living room window, that some part of me had already decided I was going to. The weeks that followed settled into something almost peaceful. My mother sent her first quarterly statement exactly on schedule, 3 days early actually, as though punctuality had become her way of proving something neither of us said out loud. Portia and I spoke less often than before, but when we did speak, there was a new, careful honesty to it, small steps toward the kind of relationship I did not know if we would ever fully reach, but one that felt, for the first time in years, like it was built on something more solid than performance. I returned to the conservation lab full-time, grateful for the particular relief of a problem with a knowable solution, a torn binding or a foxed page, damage I could actually see and measure and repair with my own 2 hands. My colleagues asked politely about the wedding, and I gave them the abbreviated version, the version with a slap in it, but not the version with a shoebox full of stolen inheritance, not yet ready to hand strangers the full shape of what my family had turned out to be. Some wounds, I was learning, needed to stay private for a while before they could survive being spoken about out loud. Julian and I spent one of those quiet evenings finally unpacking the last of the boxes from my old bedroom. It was the ordinary domestic kind of evening we had both been craving since the wedding. Cardboard flattened and stacked by the door. Books sorted onto the shelves we had built together in our small rented house. He found my grandmother's sewing quilt at the bottom of one box, the faded one from my childhood bed. Without a word, he draped it over the back of our couch, smoothing it with a care I had not expected from a man who spent his days moving numbers large enough to reshape entire companies. "She would have liked you," I told him, watching him fuss with the quilt's corners until it sat exactly where he wanted. My grandmother. She was the only person in that house who ever told me my quiet was a strength and not something to apologize for. "I believe that," he said, sitting down beside me, pulling me against his shoulder. "I think that's exactly why she left you something worth protecting. She knew you'd notice if it ever went missing, eventually." I laughed quietly, surprised that I still had laughter available to me after everything the past month had cost. It felt like the first real nightly ease we had shared since the reception, since the slap. The strange current that had run beneath our own wedding had left me changed in ways I was still cataloging. We ordered takeout and ate it straight from the containers on the coffee table. No formal plates, no performance for anyone. For a few hours, the house felt entirely ordinarily happy, the kind of happiness I had once assumed belonged only to families who had never needed to keep secrets from each other. The phone rang just after 9, breaking the stillness. I recognized my father's number on the screen before I answered, an odd, uncharacteristic pang of unease settling into my chest before he had even said a word. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice carried something I had never heard from him before. Warmer than usual, almost pleading. The careful formality he usually kept between us entirely absent. "I was hoping you might have some time this week, just the two of us. Not your mother. Not Portia. I need to talk to you about something important, and I'd rather do it in person." I glanced at Julian, who had gone still beside me, clearly hearing enough of the call to understand its weight. His easy warmth from a moment earlier was replaced by the same quiet, focused attention he gave any problem that mattered. He did not reach for the phone. He did not try to take over the conversation the way another man might have, eager to protect me from whatever was coming. He simply waited, present and steady, letting the moment belong entirely to me. "Is everything all right, Dad?" I asked, though some part of me, the part that had spent weeks now cataloging every small inconsistency surrounding him since the morning of my own wedding, already suspected the answer would not be a simple one. "It will be," he said, in a tone that did not sound remotely certain of that. "I just need to talk to you. Soon. If you can manage it. It's important, Eleanor. More important than I think you realize." I agreed to meet him Thursday, hung up the phone, and sat very still on our couch for a long moment. My grandmother's quilt draped behind me, my husband's hand steady in mine. "Do you want me to come with you?" Julian asked, gently, offering rather than insisting. "No," I said after a moment's thought. "Whatever this is, I think he needs to say it to me alone, but I want you close by, just in case it's worse than I'm expecting." He nodded, understanding immediately, and pulled me a little closer against his shoulder. We sat there together in the lamplight for a long while after, not talking, simply letting the quiet do its work. The last quiet evening I would have for some time stretching out in front of us both. though neither of us yet knew how thoroughly the coming days would test everything we had just spent this last month so carefully rebuilding. I agreed to meet my father partly out of curiosity and partly, I admit, out of a stubborn, foolish hope that not everyone in my family operated from the same quiet, self-serving logic my mother had spent 6 years living inside. I wanted badly for there to be one relationship in that house that had not been built on something hidden. I told myself that hope was reasonable. I told myself my father, whatever his strange phone calls and stranger toasts amounted to, was still the man who had kissed my forehead on my wedding morning and told me I looked like my grandmother. I did not yet know how thoroughly that hope was about to be tested, or how much further this particular thread would unravel once I finally pulled it all the way to its end. I only knew, driving to meet him that Thursday morning, that I was done letting small inconsistencies rest unexamined simply because examining them felt disruptive. I had spent 6 years learning what happens when a family lets its quiet lies sit undisturbed. I was not interested in repeating that lesson twice. My father chose the meeting place himself, a small diner on the edge of town neither of us had any real connection to. A neutral patch of vinyl booths and laminated menus, far removed from the manicured comfort of Ravenswood Manor or the careful formality of my parents' living room. I understood. The moment I saw the address he texted me, that he had chosen it deliberately, somewhere with no history attached to either of us, somewhere that offered neither of us the advantage of familiar territory. He was already seated when I arrived, a cup of black coffee cooling untouched in front of him, and he looked, for the first time in my entire adult life, genuinely uncertain of himself. My father had always carried a particular kind of authority, the quiet, immovable confidence of a man who had built something with his own hands and trusted it to hold his weight. Watching him fidget with a paper napkin, refolding it twice before I had even sat down, I understood immediately that whatever brought us to this diner had shaken something fundamental in him. I slid into the booth across from him, ordering nothing more than a glass of water when the waitress appeared, unwilling to draw out the small talk that usually preceded difficult conversations in my family. I had learned, over the past month, that small talk was often just another delay tactic, a way of postponing a truth someone did not want to say out loud, and I did not have the patience for it that afternoon. "Thank you for coming," he said, once I had settled into the booth across from him, his voice careful in a way that made me brace myself for whatever came next. "You said it was important," I said. "I'm listening." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, buying himself a few more seconds before speaking. And when he finally did, his words came out slower and more deliberate than his usual clipped, business-like cadence. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear the whole request before you decide how you feel about it," he said. "It's about Julian, about the company." Something in my chest tightened immediately. An old instinct sharpened over the past several weeks into something closer to alertness than dread. "What about the company? Things have been difficult at the plant," he admitted. And even that small admission seemed to cost him something visible, a slight slump in his shoulders that I had never once seen from him before. "More difficult than I've let anyone know. We lost a major contract 2 years ago, and we haven't fully recovered from it. I've been managing it quietly, restructuring where I can. But the credit lines we've relied on for 30 years aren't as available as they used to be. Dad, why are you telling me this instead of Mom, or a financial advisor, or literally anyone whose actual job this is supposed to be?" He looked at me directly then, and I saw, beneath the careful composure he was struggling to maintain, something that looked almost like shame. "Because I was hoping," he said slowly, "that you might introduce me to Julian, properly, as a business contact. Nothing dramatic, nothing that has to involve the family drama from the wedding, just a conversation. One businessman to another, about a possible opportunity, a modest one. I wouldn't ask if I had any other options left." I sat with that request for a long moment, turning it over. The same instinct that had guided me through the shoebox and the bank statements, and my mother's tearful confession, began to hum quietly at the edge of my thoughts. My father had spent an entire wedding toast talking about protecting a legacy at cost, and he had checked his watch obsessively on my wedding morning. He had told me just weeks ago not to dig any further than I already had, and now he was asking me, with visible discomfort, to open a door to my husband's world. Why now, I asked carefully, watching his face for anything he might not intend to reveal. Why not months ago, before any of this happened between our families? "It wasn't this urgent months ago," he said, and something in the careful precision of that sentence, the way he chose urgent instead of bad, made the small hairs on my arms rise. "How urgent is it, exactly?" I asked. He did not answer right away, and in the silence that followed, I understood, with a sinking certainty I had not fully expected, that whatever my father was not telling me was considerably larger than a modest opportunity. "I'll think about it," I said finally, unwilling to promise anything more than that in the moment, watching relief and disappointment war across his face in equal measure. "But I need you to understand something first. Dad, I'm done being handed half a story and expected to act on it. If you want my help with anything involving Julian, you're going to have to tell me exactly what I'm walking into. All of it. Not the modest version." He nodded slowly, though I could see, even as he agreed, that he was not yet ready to give me the whole truth. Not there. Not in that diner. Not with the waitress still refilling coffee 2 booths away. I drove home that afternoon with the distinct, unsettled feeling that I had just been shown the very edge of something far larger than my father was prepared to name out loud. I did not go home and ask Julian to look into it. Not right away. Something in the diner conversation had left me wanting to do this part myself. The same instinct that had sent me pulling old bank statements out of a shoebox weeks earlier. An unwillingness to hand a mystery to someone else before I had at least attempted to understand its shape with my own hands. I spent the following evening at our kitchen table with my laptop open, doing the kind of research I was trained for professionally, though the subject matter could not have been further from centuries-old manuscripts. Conservation work, at its core, is really just careful reading, learning to notice what a document is trying not to tell you. I approached my father's company with that same discipline, starting broad before narrowing in on anything that looked out of place. Voss Meridian Fabrication had a public business registration, unremarkable on its surface. It was filed as an industrial parts manufacturer, specializing in precision components for regional machinery suppliers. I found an old regional business journal article from 3 years earlier, a modest profile piece celebrating the company's 50-year anniversary. My father photographed proudly on the factory floor beside machinery that had clearly seen decades of steady use. His expression in the photograph, the same expression I remembered from childhood, a man entirely certain of his place in the world. That certainty, I was beginning to understand, had not survived the years since that photograph was taken. Buried further down in my search results, in an industry trade publication most people would never think to read, I found a much shorter piece from 18 months back, only a few paragraphs long, mentioning that Voss Meridian had lost its long-standing contract with a major regional equipment manufacturer following what the article vaguely described as a quality control dispute. The piece noted, almost as an afterthought, that the loss represented a significant portion of the company's annual revenue, though it offered no further detail about how the company intended to recover. I sat back from the screen, absorbing the shape of what I had found. A quality control dispute, a significant portion of annual revenue, unrecovered, 18 months and counting. My father, standing at a podium at my own wedding, talking about legacy and protecting things at cost. My father, checking his watch obsessively on the morning I got married, distracted by a supplier issue he refused to name. My father, calling me 2 days after my mother's confession, telling me not to dig any further than I already had. But laid end to end, the pattern felt considerably larger and considerably older than a modest opportunity requiring a casual introduction to my husband. 18 months of unrecovered revenue did not sound, to my ear, like a company managing a temporary setback. It sounded like a company quietly running out of time, a slow decline that outsiders only notice once it's too late to fix. I thought about the toast again, the one he had given at my own wedding. Legacy is not something you're given. It's something you protect. Sometimes at cost, sometimes when nobody else understands why. At the time, it had struck me as strange, oddly formal for the occasion. Reading it now against the backdrop of a lost contract and a 50-year-old company running low on options, it read less like a strange toast and more like a confession disguised as sentiment, a man rehearsing out loud and in public the justification he was already preparing to use. I texted Priya that evening, the same forensic accountant who had traced my mother's 6 years of quiet theft with such patient precision, and asked, carefully, whether her firm ever did preliminary research on companies rather than individuals, purely informational, nothing formal yet. She responded within the hour, professional and unbothered, telling me she would be glad to pull whatever public filings existed on Voss Meridian fabrication and have a preliminary summary to me by the end of the week. I was, for the first time in my life, actively going looking for the truth on my own terms, and some part of me understood, even then, that I would not be able to unknow whatever I found. Julian came home to find me still at the table. The laptop closed, but my notes spread out beside it, and he did not ask right away what I had spent the evening doing. He simply set his bag down, kissed the top of my head, and asked whether I had eaten the same small, steady kindness he offered on ordinary evenings and difficult ones alike. I told him what I had found, and what I had asked Priya to look into. And he listened without interrupting, the way he always did, though I noticed a new tightness around his eyes by the time I finished, a quiet, careful attention that told me he was already turning the same pieces over in his own mind. "Let's see what she finds," he said finally. "One step at a time. You don't have to solve this tonight." I nodded, grateful. Some part of me had already stopped believing this particular problem would resolve itself gently, one careful step at a time, the way my mother's had. Priya's preliminary summary arrived Friday afternoon. 4 pages of careful, measured language confirming what the trade publication had only hinted at. Voss Meridian Fabrication had indeed lost its primary contract 18 months earlier. The company's subsequent filings, thin as public records were, suggested a business quietly restructuring its debt in ways that read, to Priya's trained eye, as the early signs of a company running out of room to maneuver. She was careful, in her notes, to say that public filings alone could not tell the full story. Whatever was actually happening inside Voss Meridian Fabrication would require access no outsider could get without an invitation. I read her summary twice at my desk during a quiet afternoon at the conservation lab. I tucked it into a folder between 2 condition reports, so no passing colleague would glance over my shoulder and ask questions I was not ready to answer. Around me, the lab hummed with its usual gentle activity. A colleague across the room carefully humidifying a brittle map, another logging photographs of a newly acquired manuscript. It was the ordinary rhythm of a job I loved, precisely because it asked so little of my personal life, and so much of my patience with fragile, damaged things. It felt strange, reading about my father's collapsing company in the middle of all that quiet, careful repair. I was still turning the pages over in my mind an hour later, well past the point where the words had stopped offering me anything new. My desk phone rang with an unfamiliar internal extension. Eleanor Kane, I answered, distracted and half inside my father's collapsing company. The phone wedged between my shoulder and my ear as my hands kept sorting through the papers across my desk. There was a brief pause on the line, and then a man's voice, careful and a little hesitant, introduced himself as Marcus Webb. The name meant nothing to me at first, until he added quietly that he had worked as the head accountant at Voss Meridian Fabrication for the past 15 years. I got your work number from an old holiday card your father sent the office years ago, he said, an apology already threaded through his voice, as though he understood how unusual this call must sound. I'm sorry to reach out this way. I wasn't sure how else to do it without going through your parents directly. I sat up straighter in my chair, every instinct I had built over the past 6 weeks snapping suddenly, fully alert. It was the same shock I felt the first time I saw my grandmother's name on that old bank statement. It's all right, I said carefully. What can I help you with, Mr. Webb? It's not really that I need help, he said, and I could hear him choosing his next words with obvious, deliberate care. It's more that I think you might need some information. About the company, about your father. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, if you don't mind. Is there somewhere we could meet? Somewhere away from the plant? Somewhere nobody from the office would happen to see us together? The careful specificity of that last request told me almost as much as anything he might have said outright. This was not a man calling on impulse. This was a man who had thought carefully about exactly how to protect himself while still telling me whatever it was he felt I needed to hear. Something cold and clarifying settled over me. The same feeling I remembered from kneeling on my childhood bedroom floor, with my grandmother's bank statement in my hands. The unmistakable sensation of a door swinging open onto a room I had not yet been ready to enter, whether I was ready or not. Yes, I said. Anywhere you're comfortable, whenever works for you. We agreed to meet the following Tuesday at a small park, equidistant from both our workplaces. It was a place with no connection to my family, no connection to the plant, nothing that might make either of us feel watched. I hung up the phone and sat very still at my desk for a long moment, my half-finished condition report forgotten in front of me. I understood with a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever Marcus Webb had spent 15 years quietly observing at my father's company was about to become mine to carry as well. I did not tell Julian about the call right away. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, one more day of not yet knowing, one more evening where the worst thing hanging over our household was still an unconfirmed suspicion rather than a fully named fact. Something I could still, if I chose to, set aside for a few hours and pretend belonged to some other, less complicated version of my life. I told him that night anyway, because I had promised myself weeks earlier, after everything with my mother, that I would not keep him in the dark about anything that touched our life together. And a promise like that only meant something if I honored it even on the nights I would rather have stayed quiet. He listened, as he always did, without interrupting. And when I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing the same slow, steadying circles against my knuckles that had become, over the past weeks, a kind of unspoken language between us. "Whatever he tells you," Julian said quietly, "you don't have to carry it alone, not this time, and not any of the times after this one, however many there turn out to be." Marcus Webb was a small, careful man in his early 50s, the kind of person who seemed built for a life spent quietly balancing other people's numbers. And he arrived at the park bench we had agreed on 10 minutes early, a thin folder tucked under one arm, glancing around the empty walking path twice before he finally sat down beside me. "I want to say first that I've worked for your father for 15 years, he said, his voice, even though there was no one within earshot. "I respect him. I respected him. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest of this, because what I'm about to say isn't easy for me either." I told him to take his time, and he did, drawing a slow breath before he continued. A jogger passed behind us on the path, and Marcus waited until the sound of footsteps faded before he spoke again, a caution that told me, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much weight he had been carrying alone. "The plant is not simply struggling, Mrs. Kane. It's failing. Has been for well over a year. After we lost the Rayburn contract, the numbers never recovered. And rather than restructure honestly, your father asked me to adjust certain figures on our quarterly reports to the bank, enough to keep our credit lines open while he searched for a way out. I did it. I want to be honest about that. I told myself I was protecting 50 years of jobs, protecting people who had worked the floor for decades and had nowhere else to go if the plant closed. I'm not sure anymore whether that was the right choice or simply the easier one. I sat very still, absorbing the shape of it, the same cold clarity I had felt in my childhood bedroom settling over me again. There was a strange, familiar rhythm to this moment. Hearing a trusted employee describe, calmly and precisely, exactly how a family member had quietly reshaped the truth to suit their own needs. I had lived some version of this conversation already, weeks earlier. It had happened across a different table, with a different parent. I did not know yet whether that made this easier or harder to hear. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Mr. Webb," I asked. "Why not go to the board, or the bank, or somewhere that could actually stop it before it goes any further?" "Because I think it's about to get much worse," he said. "And I think you're the only person who might be able to stop that part before it happens." He opened the folder in his lap, careful even now. He slid a single printed page toward me. It was an application, formal and precise, for an emergency bridge loan. It was submitted under Voss Meridian Fabrications' corporate letterhead to a private equity firm I recognized instantly. Kane Meridian Capital. "Your father filed this 3 weeks ago," Marcus said quietly, "before he ever asked to meet you at that diner. From what I understand, the introduction he wanted from you wasn't the beginning of anything, Mrs. Kane. It was cover, a way to make an already submitted application look like an organic family connection instead of what it actually is." The park suddenly felt very far away. The ordinary sounds of joggers and dog walkers faded into something distant and unimportant. He already knew, I said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one colder than the last. He knew who Julian was, before the wedding. Marcus nodded, and something in his expression told me the worst part was still coming. He's known for months, he said. Your father does business, indirectly, with several firms your husband's company has worked with. He recognized the name the moment your engagement was announced, though he never told anyone in your family. I only know because I overheard him on the phone with a business contact, confirming it weeks before your wedding. Did Portia know, I asked, though some part of me had already guessed the answer, some old, uneasy memory of my sister's strange stillness during my father's toast finally beginning to make sense. I believe he told her something, the night before your wedding, Marcus said carefully. I wasn't there, but I overheard your father on the phone the next morning, telling someone that he'd mentioned it to Portia in confidence. That he'd told her Julian was richer than any of you had ever imagined, and that she needed to, in his words, be smart about how she treated him. I sat on that park bench for a long time after Marcus finished speaking, the folder resting in my lap. For the first time I understood why my sister had seemed so uniquely, viciously bitter that night. She had just learned that the marriage was far more consequential than anyone let her believe, and chose, instead of caution, to lash out anyway. It did not excuse what Portia had done. Nothing Marcus told me that afternoon changed the fact that her hand had been the one that struck me. Her choices belonged to her alone, regardless of what our father had whispered to her the night before. But it reframed the entire evening in a way I had not expected. It made a single act of sibling cruelty the smallest, most visible piece of something our father had been quietly orchestrating for months, long before either of his daughters had any idea a plan existed at all. Thank you, I told Marcus finally, my voice steadier than I felt. For telling me this. I know it wasn't easy, and I know it puts you at risk. I've thought about that, he said, closing the folder gently, as though even now some part of him hoped to protect the fragile trust it represented. I decided I'd rather be honest and unemployed than complicit and comfortable. I'm sorry it fell to you to hear it from a stranger in a park instead of your own father. I told him it was not his fault. And I meant it. The words felt small against the size of what I now understood I had to do next. I went home that evening and told Julian everything, sitting at our kitchen table with Marcus Webb's printed application still folded inside my bag. I could only look at it for a few seconds at a time before the same cold clarity rose up in my chest again. Julian listened in near silence, his jaw tightening at certain points, his hands going still on the table in a way I had come to recognize as his version of controlled fury, the same stillness he had shown at my own wedding reception. Immediately before he crossed a ballroom to stand between me and everyone who had wronged me, I found myself, even in the middle of my own distress, watching him with something like fascination. This man who had built an entire private language out of quiet, careful restraint, and who I was only now beginning to fully understand as someone capable of enormous consequence beneath all that stillness. I'm sorry, I said, when I finally ran out of details to give him. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you married me, a wife who keeps finding fresh betrayals buried in her own family. Don't, he said, more firmly than I expected. Don't apologize for the people who hurt you. Eleanor, not to me, not to anyone. You didn't do this. You're the one who keeps finding the courage to look at it honestly instead of pretending it isn't happening. That's not a burden you're placing on me, that's just who you are. I need to check something, he said. Once I had finished, already reaching for his phone. Quietly. Tonight, before you decide anything else. I want to know exactly what's actually sitting in our intake pipeline. He made a call I was not meant to fully understand, low and technical, referencing application numbers and review stages in the careful shorthand of his industry. And when he finally set the phone down, his expression had shifted into something graver than I had seen from him, even during the worst of the wedding chaos. "It's real," he said. "The application was submitted through standard corporate channels 3 weeks ago, exactly as your source described. It's currently sitting in preliminary review, flagged for expedited handling." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "Eleanor, applications like this don't get expedited without someone specifically requesting it. Someone inside the company asked for your father's file to move faster than the standard queue." "Who would do that?" I asked, though some sick, sinking part of me had already begun assembling an answer I did not particularly want to reach. Some quiet dread that the truth would turn out to involve me more directly than I was prepared for. I don't know yet," Julian said, already standing, already reaching for his laptop bag by the door, "but I intend to find out before tomorrow morning, whatever that takes." He did find out, eventually, though it took him most of the following day, working quietly through channels he did not fully explain to me, protecting some boundary of professional discretion even in the middle of a crisis that had become deeply, unavoidably personal. The expedite request, it turned out, had come from an analyst 2 levels below Julian himself, a young associate. In an internal memo, he noted that the applicant shared a surname with a name he recognized from an internal contact list. My own name listed as Julian's spouse on routine paperwork filed after our courthouse wedding. The associate had assumed, reasonably enough, that a family connection meant the file deserved a faster look, entirely unaware of the deception layered underneath that assumption. It was, in its own small way, almost darkly funny. My father's plan had been quietly accelerated by an employee trying to be helpful to a boss's new in-law, entirely unaware that the in-law in question had no idea any of this was happening, until a stranger flagged it to her in a park. I thought about how many small, well-intentioned decisions like that one probably existed inside every large, complicated system. Ordinary people were trying to be helpful, never imagining the tangled personal history their small kindness might be quietly accelerating. I asked Julian what would happen next. Procedurally, if nothing intervened. He explained it to me plainly, without softening any of it for my benefit, the way I had asked him to be with me from the very beginning. The application would continue through standard review. Given the strength of the falsified figures Marcus had described, it would likely pass an initial screening within days. It would then move toward a formal in-person meeting to finalize terms, the exact kind of meeting where a man like my father, confident and rehearsed, would expect to shake hands with strangers and walk out with a solution to a problem he had spent a year hiding from everyone who loved him. "He's going to think it's working," I said quietly, once Julian explained it to me. "He's going to think the introduction he asked me for actually helped him. He has no idea we already know." Julian reached across the table and took my hand. "Then we let him keep thinking that," he said, "until it's time for him to understand exactly how much we know, and exactly why pretending was never going to work." He held my gaze for a long moment, steady and certain. "We'll do this together, Eleanor. Not me protecting you from a distance. Together, the way we should have been handling all of this from the very beginning." Over the following days, Julian and I worked out a plan together at our kitchen table the way other couples might plan a vacation. We were methodical and careful, though the stakes could not have been further from anything resembling leisure. I had wanted, at first, to simply deny the application outright, to end the whole quiet deception before it went any further. I wanted to spare everyone the theater of a formal meeting neither of us wanted to sit through. Julian talked me through why that instinct, however understandable, would not actually serve the outcome I truly wanted. More than once during those conversations, I was grateful he was willing to slow me down rather than simply agree with whatever I said first, the way people sometimes do with someone they love when that person is clearly in pain. "I know you want this over quickly," he said gently, during one particular evening when my frustration had gotten the better of my patience. "I understand that instinct completely, but quickly and rightly aren't always the same thing. I don't think you actually want quickly if it means he never has to face what he did." "If we kill it quietly now," he said, spreading a legal pad between us covered in his own careful shorthand. "Your father never has to see the consequences of what he actually did. He'll assume it was a routine denial, bad luck, market conditions, anything except the truth. He'll go looking for another lender, another cover story, and he'll never have to reckon with the fact that his own daughter caught him. So what do we do instead? We let the standard process work exactly the way it's supposed to," Julian said. "Full underwriting review, every number, every filing, checked against the actual financial reality of the company, not the version he submitted. It will surface the falsified figures on its own, through entirely normal channels, no favors, no special treatment either direction. And then we bring him in for the final review meeting, the same one every applicant goes through. Except this time you're in the room, not as his daughter, but as someone with a legitimate seat at the table." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I turned over any plan before agreeing to it. There was something almost unbearably fitting about it. My father's carefully constructed deception would be undone not by a dramatic confrontation staged for effect, but by the same ordinary, unglamorous due diligence that any company seeking that much money would have to survive regardless of who was asking. He had spent so many years convinced the rules bent for men who looked certain, even when they weren't. I liked the idea of him discovering, finally, that they did not because anyone had decided to punish him for it, but simply because the numbers themselves refused to cooperate with the story he needed them to tell. "And Marcus," I added, "whatever happens, he can't lose his job over this. He came to me at real risk to himself." "Agreed," Julian said immediately, without hesitation. And something in the speed of that answer told me he had already been thinking about the same thing. "I don't want to destroy the plant," I said finally. "I keep thinking about the people who work there. 50 years of employees who had nothing to do with any of this. Marcus, who risked his own career just to tell me the truth. The people my father actually built something real with, even if he spent the last year lying to protect it the wrong way instead of asking anyone for honest help." Julian nodded slowly, and I could see him already turning the problem toward its next stage, the part of him that had built an entire career out of finding structural solutions rather than simple verdicts. "Then we don't have to choose between exposing him and protecting them," he said. "There are other paths. Restructuring under independent oversight. A different kind of capital, with real conditions attached. Real accountability, instead of the blank check he was hoping to walk away with. We can save the plant without letting your father keep pretending none of this happened." It was, I realized, exactly the kind of justice I had learned to want over the past 2 months. Not the version that burned everything down for the satisfaction of watching it burn, but the version that made the truth undeniable and still left room, however narrow, for something worth salvaging on the other side of it. "Okay," I said. "Let's do it that way." We spent the rest of that evening drafting the outline of what an independent restructuring might actually look like, Julian sketching rough terms on his legal pad, while I filled in the details I understood better than he did. The names and faces behind 50 years of employment records, the machinists and floor supervisors and administrative staff whose entire livelihoods depended on decisions being made. That night, at our own kitchen table, without their knowledge. It felt strange, carrying that kind of weight quietly, deciding the shape of so many strangers' futures before either of them had any idea their jobs were even at risk. By the time we finally went to bed, well past midnight, we had the beginnings of a real plan, one that did not require me to become someone I did not recognize in order to see it through. And I fell asleep feeling, for the first time since Marcus Webb's phone call, something almost like steadiness. The night before the review meeting, I could not sleep, and I did not try very hard to force it. I lay awake beside Julian, who had finally drifted off sometime past midnight, his breathing slow and even in the dark. I let my mind wander backward through every version of my father I had ever known, trying to hold all of them at once instead of collapsing him into the single, simple villain it would have been so much easier to make him into. There was the father who taught me to read a topographic map on a camping trip when I was 9, patient and thorough, tracing contour lines with his finger until the abstract shapes finally resolved into hills and valleys I could actually picture. There was the father who drove 4 hours each way to attend my graduate program's small, unglamorous lecture on paper conservation, sitting in the back row of a half-empty auditorium, applauding louder than anyone else in the room. There was also the father who checked his watch on my wedding morning instead of looking at me. He gave a toast about legacy that was really a rehearsal for a lie. And he let his own daughter walk into a business meeting blind, rather than simply telling her the truth and asking for her help honestly. I turned each of these memories over slowly, one after another, the way I once turned pages of a damaged manuscript. I was careful not to force anything, patient enough to let the full picture emerge on its own timeline, instead of the one I wanted it to follow. I did not think these versions of him canceled each other out. That was, perhaps, the hardest lesson of the past 2 months, harder even than the specific dollar amounts or the specific betrayals. The slow understanding that people rarely arrive as one clean thing or another. My mother had loved me and failed me in the same 6 years, sometimes in the same conversation. My sister had resented me and, in her own chaotic way, still shown up when it counted, standing frozen at the edge of a stage, finally understanding what she had done. And my father, whatever else he had done, had also taught me that patience was not weakness and that careful attention to small details eventually revealed the whole shape of a thing. I had used that lesson, without any irony I could have predicted as a child, to eventually catch him. I thought about Julian's family, or the version of it I had gathered from the little he shared. Quieter and more private than mine, shaped by his own complicated history with money and the people who had wanted access to it more than they had ever wanted him. He understood, in a way few people could, what it meant to hold love and suspicion in the same hand and not be able to fully set either one down. It was, I realized, part of why he never once suggested I simply cut my family away entirely, the way a stranger with less history might have advised. He did not believe complicated people were disposable. He had built an entire, quiet, careful life around learning to tell the difference between someone worth protecting yourself from and someone worth holding accountable while still, somehow, remaining in the room with them. I got up quietly, careful not to wake him, and stood for a while at our bedroom window, looking out at the dark, ordinary street below. It was the same kind of street I had once assumed my whole life would look like, small and unremarkable and entirely mine. So much had changed since my wedding day, and yet the essential shape of what I wanted had not changed at all. I had never wanted an empire. I had never wanted my father's ruin. I had only ever wanted to stop being the daughter nobody thought to tell the truth to. Somewhere in the last 2 months, without ever intending to, I had finally become someone impossible to lie to convincingly. Somewhere in the depth of that sleepless hour, I stopped asking myself whether I could forgive my father, because I understood, finally, that forgiveness was not actually the question in front of me. The question was smaller and larger at once. Could I hold him accountable, fully and honestly, without deciding that accountability required erasing him from my life entirely? Could justice and love occupy the same room, even an uncomfortable one, even one with hard conditions attached? I did not reach a full answer that night. I am not sure a full answer exists for a question like that, tidy and permanent, the kind you could write down once and never have to revisit. But I reached something close enough to peace to finally close my eyes. My hand rested lightly against Julian's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that had chosen, from the very beginning, to stand beside me rather than protect me from a distance. Tomorrow, I would sit across a table from my father in a room built for exactly this kind of reckoning. Tonight, I only wanted to remember that the man walking into that room tomorrow morning was still, somehow, impossibly, the same man who had once traced contour lines across a paper map. He had done it just to watch his daughter's face light up when the shapes finally made sense. I climbed back into bed as the sky outside began its first faint shift toward gray, and Julian stirred slightly, pulling me closer without fully waking, some instinct in him reaching for me even in sleep. I lay there in the last dark hour before morning, listening to his steady breathing, and allowed myself, finally, to rest. Kane Meridian Capital's headquarters occupied the top 11 floors of a glass tower downtown. I had visited it perhaps a dozen times since the wedding, always as Julian's wife rather than as anyone with an actual professional role inside its walls. Today was different. Today I wore a tailored charcoal suit instead of my usual work clothes, and I carried a leather folio containing a title I had spent the past week helping draft with Julian's legal team Independent Family Liaison. It was a formal, narrowly defined advisory role created specifically to review any transaction where a conflict of interest existed between the firm and a family member of an executive. It was not, strictly speaking, invented for this occasion, though it had certainly been finalized with unusual speed. Julian's governance policies had always required some mechanism for handling exactly this kind of situation, family members intersecting with active deals, and my role simply formalized what would otherwise have happened informally anyway. I had a legitimate seat at that table. It only happened to be a seat that also let me look my father directly in the eye. I had spent the drive downtown that morning rehearsing nothing, the same way I had approached my mother's kitchen table weeks earlier, understanding by now that scripted confrontations rarely survived contact with the actual person sitting across from you. I wanted to be present, clear-headed, and honest. I did not want to perform anger I did not entirely feel. and I did not want to perform forgiveness I had not yet earned my way toward either. I simply wanted to be exactly as truthful with my father as I had learned to be with everyone else over the past 2 months, including myself. I arrived early and took my place in the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor, seated at the long table beside 2 of Julian's senior underwriters, both of whom had spent the past week combing through Voss Meridian Fabrications' submitted financials line by line, cross-referencing them against the actual filings Priya's independent review had already surfaced. Once people with full access and full authority investigated, the discrepancies proved even more extensive than Marcus Webb had described. There was an entire second set of numbers quietly maintained, alongside the ones submitted to the bank. My father arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, dressed in the same careful, confident suit he always wore to meetings that mattered. His expression was composed and rehearsed, the look of a man walking into a room expecting to close a deal he had already convinced himself was practically finished. He did not see me at first. He shook hands with the underwriters and exchanged a few pleasant, well-practiced remarks about the weather and the view from the 40th floor. He settled into his chair at the far end of the table, with the easy confidence of a man who had given this exact kind of presentation dozens of times over a 50-year career. Then his eyes moved down the table and found me. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The practiced confidence drained from his face in stages. First confusion, then a slow, dawning horror as he registered not just my presence, but my seat, my folio, the small brass placard in front of me bearing a title he had clearly never expected to see attached to my name. "Eleanor," he said, his voice catching slightly. "What is this? What are you doing here?" "I work with the firm reviewing this application." "Dad," I said, keeping my voice level, professional, the same voice I used when explaining a difficult restoration decision to an anxious donor. "In an advisory capacity, specifically for situations exactly like this one." He looked from me to the underwriters and back again, his composure fractured with every passing second, some part of him still trying to construct an explanation that would make this look like a coincidence, a misunderstanding, anything other than what it plainly was. "I don't understand," he said, though the tremor in his voice suggested some deeper part of him had already begun to. "I think you do," I said quietly. "I think you've understood for a while now, longer than you've let any of us believe." The room went very still. The 2 underwriters beside me kept the careful, professional silence of people who understood how much was happening beneath the surface, without needing any of it explained to them directly. My father's hands, resting on the polished table in front of him, had curled slightly, not quite fists. He held the posture of a man bracing for an impact he could not yet fully name. "Whatever you think you know," he started, reaching instinctively for the same tone he had used at my own wedding, the tone of a man accustomed to steering rooms back toward the version of events he preferred. "I can explain all of it. There's context you're missing." "I know about the second set of numbers, Dad," I said, watching the last of his composure finally give way entirely. "I know you've known who Julian actually is since months before my wedding. I know you told Portia the night before the ceremony. And I know that's very likely part of why she was standing at that microphone the way she was. And I know you filed this application knowing full well the figures inside it weren't true." He did not answer right away. For a long moment, my father, a man who had spent 50 years building an identity around unshakable confidence, simply sat there, silent, visibly searching for a version of the truth small enough to survive the room he had just walked into. "I did it for the company," my father finally said, his voice cracking around the edges of what little composure remained. "For 50 years of people who've worked that floor since before you were born, Eleanor." What was I supposed to do? Let it all collapse because of one bad contract I was trying to buy us time? I was going to fix the real numbers once we had breathing room. It was never going to hurt anyone. "It already hurt someone," I said. "It hurt Marcus, who you asked to falsify records for over a year, putting his own career at risk to protect yours. It hurt Portia, who you handed a piece of information the night before my wedding and then let carry the weight of it alone, without ever explaining why it mattered enough to change how she should have behaved. And it would have hurt every single person in this building if that application had gone through on numbers that weren't real, because it would have meant lying to people who trusted you enough to consider giving you $150,000 in good faith." He flinched at the specific number, hearing it spoken aloud in a room full of people whose job was to evaluate that exact kind of request on its merits. Then something in his face cracked open into something rawer than the careful confidence he had walked in wearing. I watched 50 years of practiced authority visibly leave his shoulders. The posture he had carried into that boardroom collapsed inward until he looked, for the first time in my memory, like an old man rather than the immovable figure who had once seemed too large for any room he entered. One of the underwriters beside me shifted slightly in her seat, a small professional movement that reminded me we were not actually alone. Everything happening across the table was being witnessed, documented, folded into whatever official record this meeting would eventually become. I found, strangely, that I did not mind the audience. Some part of me had spent my whole life absorbing my family's dysfunction in private, quietly, without witnesses. And there was an unexpected relief in finally having this reckoning happen somewhere real consequences could actually attach themselves to it. "I didn't know how else to save it," he said, quieter now, some of the performance finally draining out of his voice. "I've spent my whole life being the man who kept that company running. I didn't know who I was supposed to be if I couldn't keep doing that. It was, I realized, the most honest thing my father had said to me in months, maybe longer. An admission that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with a fear so old it had calcified into every other decision he had made since the contract collapsed." I looked at Julian, who gave me the smallest of nods, and I opened the folio in front of me, sliding a single document across the table toward my father. "The application in its current form is denied," I said. "The figures don't hold up, and you know that better than anyone in this room. But there's a second option here, if you want it, a restructuring package under independent financial oversight. Real terms, real accountability, real transparency going forward. It protects the jobs. It does not protect your unilateral control over the company. You'd answer to an oversight board for the foreseeable future, board approval on any major decision, quarterly audits, the works." My father stared at the document for a long moment without touching it, and I watched him do the same math I imagined he had been avoiding for over a year, weighing the wound to his pride against everything else actually at stake. "And if I refuse," he said finally, "what happens to the plant? Then it fails on its own timeline, without our help." I said honestly, "I'm not going to pretend that's not also on the table, but I'd rather you choose the version where 50 years of people keep their jobs, even if it costs you something you don't want to give up." He picked up the document with visibly unsteady hands. For a long silent moment he simply read while the room held its breath, the way 600 wedding guests once had, waiting to see which version of my father would finally answer. "Marcus," he said finally, not looking up from the page, "whatever happens to me, whatever this board decides, I need him protected. He didn't deserve to be put in the position I put him in." "He's already protected," I told him. "That was never in question. I made sure of that before I ever agreed to sit in this room." Something in my father's expression shifted at that. A quick, guilty flicker, maybe shame, maybe the first faint stir of respect for the daughter he'd spent so long underestimating without even realizing it. He set the document down and smoothed it flat against the table with both palms. He reached, finally, for the pen one of the underwriters had left within his reach. "I have conditions of my own," he said. Quieter now, some old stubbornness returning to his voice, though this time it sounded less like arrogance and more like a man trying to salvage a scrap of dignity from the wreckage of his choices. "I want to be the one who tells the floor what's happening, not a stranger from an oversight board. They deserve to hear it from me." I looked at Julian, who nodded once. Something in my chest loosened. A small, cautious relief that the man across the table had not entirely lost the instinct to protect the people who depended on him, even now. "That's fair," I said. "I think that's the least you owe them." My father called a full meeting of the plant floor 2 days later. Standing on an overturned crate in the same building where he had spent 50 years, building both a company and a version of himself, he could no longer entirely defend. He told his employees the truth plainly, without the polished evasions I'd watched him deploy at family dinners for most of my life. He told them about the lost contract. He told them about the falsified numbers, and why he had done it, and what it would cost him now that the truth had surfaced. He told them a new oversight board would be reviewing every major decision going forward, and that their jobs, as far as anyone could currently promise, were safe. Marcus told me afterward that several of the older machinists, men who had known my father since before I was born, shook his hand on the way out. It wasn't celebration exactly, but from Marcus's description it looked like respect for a man who had finally chosen honesty over the pride that had nearly cost them everything. Marcus himself kept his position, formally protected under the new oversight structure exactly as promised. He told me, with a small, tired laugh, that he intended to start looking for other opportunities regardless, unwilling to spend the rest of his career waiting to see whether honesty would be rewarded so generously a second time. I did not blame him for that. I understood, better than most people could, how much trust a person loses the capacity to extend freely once they have watched it broken from somewhere they least expected. My mother, when she learned the full scope of what my father had done, sat with me in her kitchen for a long, quiet afternoon, absorbing it the way I imagined she was still absorbing so much else about our family's last 2 months. She did not defend him. She did not, this time, reach for any explanation that reduced what he had done to something smaller and more forgivable than it actually was. "I think I always knew something was wrong at the plant," she admitted, staring into a cup of tea she had not touched. "I just didn't ask. I think, if I'm honest, I've spent most of my marriage not asking things I was afraid to hear the answers to." I recognized the shape of that sentence immediately, because I had spent most of my life practicing exactly the same avoidance, in my own quieter way, simply pointed inward instead of outward. It did not excuse either of them. It did explain, at least partially, how an entire family could live for so long with unasked questions. Each of us guarding ourselves against a truth none of us wanted to be the one to name first. Portia's reaction when the full truth reached her was quieter than I expected. She came to see me alone, without prompting, and sat across from me at my kitchen table with none of her usual polish. None of the performance I had grown so used to over a lifetime of watching her manage every room she entered. "He used me," she said finally, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "That night, at the wedding. He handed me information and let me carry it without telling me what it actually meant. I was so angry about being overlooked, and he just let me stay angry because it was useful to him." "I know," I said. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel better. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to understand exactly how far this went, on every side of it." She nodded slowly, tears finally slipping down her face. For the first time since the wedding, I reached across the table and took her hand. Not because everything between us was resolved, but because I finally understood that we had both been shaped by the same quiet dishonesty, only from opposite ends. "I don't know how we rebuild this," she said quietly. "Any of it, Mom, Dad, us. I don't even know where you'd start with something this broken." "Slowly," I told her. "Honestly, one real conversation at a time, instead of 6 more years of nobody saying the actual thing out loud. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, not fully. But it was, for the first time in longer than either of us could probably remember, the truth, spoken plainly, between two sisters finally done pretending they did not see each other clearly. Julian found me on the porch that evening, after Portia had gone home, sitting quietly with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, watching the last light drain out of an ordinary Tuesday sky. He did not ask how the conversation had gone. He simply sat down beside me, pulled my feet into his lap the way he always did, and let the quiet do the rest of the talking neither of us needed to do out loud. "You did more today than dismantle a lie," he said eventually. "You gave your whole family a chance to stop telling it. That's not nothing, Eleanor, even if none of them take you up on it right away." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time in 2 exhausting months, something that resembled an ending rather than another beginning, and let myself simply rest in it. 6 months after my sister slapped me in front of 600 people, I stood in the same rose garden at Ravenswood Manor, wearing a simpler dress than the one I had chosen the first time, and married Julian Kane again, properly, publicly, in front of everyone who actually deserved to be there. We kept the guest list small this time, 40 people instead of 600, seated on wooden folding chairs arranged around the same stone fountain where we had once read torn pages of handwritten vows to each other by lantern light. There was no orchestra this time, only a single cellist playing something quiet near the pergola, no towering floral arrangements, no 10-tier displays waiting to be knocked over by anyone's carelessness. Everything about the day had been chosen deliberately small, a direct answer to everything the first attempt had gotten wrong. My mother sat in the front row beside my father, their hands not quite touching. 2 people still learning how to occupy the same space honestly after a lifetime of practiced avoidance. She wore a simple blue dress instead of the designer gown she had worn to my first wedding. When I caught her eye during the ceremony, she did not perform the bright, camera-ready smile I remembered from every family event of my childhood. She simply looked at me, steady and unguarded, and it was, in its own quiet way, more than she had ever offered me in a room full of witnesses before. Portia stood up as my maid of honor, a role she had asked for rather than assumed. She read a short, unpolished toast that had none of the performance her first one carried, just a plain, halting apology, folded into a promise to keep doing better, one honest year at a time. Her voice shook through most of it. She did not try to hide that it did. The past 6 months had not resolved cleanly, and I want to be honest about that. The tidy version of this story would do a disservice to how repair actually happens in real families. My mother's repayment schedule remained on track, each quarterly statement arriving exactly when promised. By then, the money itself had become almost beside the point, a formality attached to something much harder she and I were still rebuilding in slower, quieter increments, one honest phone call at a time. She and my father had started attending counseling together twice a month. She mentioned it to me almost shyly, as though admitting the marriage needed real work was its own small act of courage after decades of performing effortlessness for an audience that no longer existed. Voss Meridian Fabrication was still standing, restructured under the oversight board exactly as we had agreed. My father was stripped of unilateral control, but still present on the floor most mornings, walking the line, no longer the sole architect of the company's fate, but still, undeniably, part of its story. He had aged visibly in the months since the boardroom confrontation, more gray at his temples and a slower walk. There was something steadier in him, too. A man no longer carrying an entire company's survival alone in silence. He called me most Sundays now, actual conversations rather than logistics. We had not fully rebuilt what a wedding morning kiss on the forehead once represented. But we were building something else in its place, slower, more honest, imperfect in ways that felt, finally, real instead of performed. Marcus Webb left for a position at a competing firm 3 months after the boardroom meeting, and I could not fault him for it. Some kinds of trust, once broken, are better rebuilt somewhere new rather than forced back into their original shape. He sent me a card when he left, thanking me for listening to him on a park bench when he had nothing to offer in return but an uncomfortable truth. I kept it in the same drawer where I kept my grandmother's old letters, the fragile things worth protecting. Portia had taken a job as an assistant manager at a small, independently owned bookstore 2 towns over, a position with a modest salary and no glamour attached to it whatsoever. The last time we spoke, she told me it was the first job she had ever held that nobody else had funded into existence for her. She was not transformed overnight. She still had hard days, still occasionally reached for old defensive habits when a conversation cut too close to something uncomfortable. But she showed up, week after week, to a life she was building with her own 2 hands for the first time. And that, I had come to understand, was worth more than any dramatic conversion story could have been. I did not become someone unrecognizable through any of this either. I still worked full-time at the conservation lab, still spent my days coaxing brittle paper back into shapes that could survive another century of careful handling. I had simply stopped believing that patience with fragile things meant I owed the same endless patience to people who mishandled me. Julian and I used a portion of what remained of my grandmother's recovered trust to establish a small scholarship fund at Ashworth University, supporting students studying paper and archive conservation, a field that rarely paid well and rarely received recognition. Precisely the kind of quiet, overlooked work my grandmother had once told me was worth doing regardless of who noticed. We named it after her, the Margaret Voss Fellowship for Archival Preservation, and I like to imagine she would have found that funnier than sentimental. Her name finally attached to something that outlasted every dollar that had ever been quietly moved away from it. Standing in that garden on my 2nd wedding day, watching 40 people who actually knew me raise their glasses instead of 600 strangers waiting to see what happened next. I understood something I wished I could have told the version of myself who once believed love required constant, careful shrinking to be safe. You do not have to make yourself smaller to be loved correctly. You do not have to disappear into quiet, uncomplaining usefulness to earn a place at your own family's table. The people who actually see you, who actually choose you honestly, will never once ask you to fold yourself into something more convenient for their comfort. My sister slapped me in front of 600 people because she did not yet understand what she was actually looking at. By the time the story reached its end, she understood completely. And so, finally, did I. If you have ever been the quiet one in your family, the reliable one, the one nobody thought to check on because you always seemed fine, I hope this story reminded you that fine is not the same as seen. You are allowed, at any point, to stop accepting the difference.